Hey there, sleepyheads. Tonight's tale is a little gritty, a little minty, and just the tiniest bit chalky. We're sinking our teeth gently into one of the most unexpected, underexplored corners of medieval life. How peasants cleaned their teeth. Or rather, how they didn't, or didn't need to, or how they got by with a twig, a rag, a handful of herbs, and a prayer to St. Apollonia. No toothbrush, no toothpaste, no minty swish of mouthwash. Just the rhythm of a simpler life. The crunch of coarse bread, and a surprising amount of sage. You might think it sounds gross, and sometimes it was. But tonight, we're brushing away the myths to find something oddly clever, and even a little charming, beneath the grime. Before we fray the end of a hazelwood stick and scrape it across our imaginary molars, take a moment to like this if you love these soft-spoken wanderings into the dirtier and delightfully human parts of the past. If you're new here, welcome to this quiet little nook of history, where we whisper about the strange, the forgotten, and the oddly comforting details of how people once lived and breathed and flossed with stalks of rye. And if your eyes are already heavy, no worries, you can always come back tomorrow. The past isn't going anywhere. It's still spitting clove seeds into the fire and rinsing with vinegar behind a cottage door. Now, before we begin, drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from. Which country, what time of night, and what's the weather like outside your window? Are you curled under a quilt with the heat humming low, or wrapped in a hoodie, sipping tea with your window cracked to let in the breeze? I want to know what your evening feels like. And if you haven't already, grab a cozy drink or your favourite sleepy snack. Something soft, something sweet, maybe not too sugary in honour of tonight's topic. Okay, now, let the light fade. Let the hush settle over you like a linen veil hung out to dry. Take a deep breath, in through the nose, out through the mouth, and imagine you're sitting by the hearth, chewing on a sprig of mint as your grandmother hands you a bundle of cloth and says, "Go on then, scrub the corners." Because even in the Middle Ages, a clean mouth mattered, just not in the way you might expect. Close your eyes. The year is 1327. Somewhere in the English countryside, mist clings low to a hedgerow. The soil is still soft with morning dew, and crows are calling out from a thatched rooftop. In a nearby cottage, a fire crackles faintly in the hearth. A woman in woolen skirts pours a ladle of thick, savoury pottage into a wooden bowl. Her son, barefoot and yawning, waits with rough hands folded, his teeth already chewing the air in anticipation. The bowl contains turnips, barley, cabbage, not a whisper of sweetness, unless a carrot snuck in unannounced, and that, more or less, was breakfast. In the world of medieval peasants, sweetness was a stranger. There were no cupboards stocked with chocolate, no baskets of foil-wrapped candies, no toast dusted with cinnamon sugar, and certainly no shimmering, syrup-drenched stacks of pancakes to start the day. There was no start the day sweet at all, only filling it, fueling it, quietly enduring it. The medieval diet was not designed for pleasure, not in the way we know it. It was born from need, from land, from limits. A peasant's food was gathered, harvested, and shaped by the wheel of seasons and the yield of soil. If the oats grew well, there was porridge. If they didn't, there was less porridge. And sugar? That was a word reserved for lords and apothecaries, for merchants and priests, not for the woman kneading dough with her elbows, or the boy chasing hens around a crooked fence. Sugar, in its refined form, was more medicine than ingredient. It came from distant lands, packed tightly into cones or loaves, carefully shaved into powders for the ill, or melted into tiny lozenges by monks with nimble hands. It was not spooned into tea. Tea didn't exist. It wasn't stirred into oatmeal or baked into crusts. It was hoarded, weighed, sold at high cost. A single pound could feed a rumour for months. For the average villager, sugar was invisible. Instead, they ate what was near, what was now. Coarse black bread sliced with a knife and soaked in ale, cabbage boiled to softness, beans mashed with herbs, apples, tart, green and sour, not the polished, sugary spheres we know today. These were fruits with spots, with blemishes, with character. And fruit itself was fleeting. It grew only in its season and was eaten quickly. There were no supermarkets stocked with strawberries in winter. No bananas shipped across oceans. When the berries ripened, you picked them. When the pears fell, you gathered them. And once they were gone, they were gone. Even honey, that golden glistening nectar, was scarce. Bees were kept by some, yes, and wild hives were sometimes found. But honey required carelage, protection from theft, and a good season. Most of what was harvested went toward preserving fruits, flavouring ale, or healing wounds. It was not poured into tea or spread on toast. It was sacred, not snackable. And so in a world without sugar, what became of their teeth? They stayed stronger than you'd think. You see, the bacteria that causes cavities thrives on sugar. It feeds on it, breeds in it, turns it into acid that slowly dissolves the enamel like rain on stone. But without a steady sugar supply, that process struggles. Without soda sipped all day, without sweet drinks between meals, without sticky caramel lodged in crevices, the teeth simply had fewer enemies. Even without toothbrushes, enamel endured. Were their teeth perfect? No. They were stained from iron-rich water, crooked from childhood, worn from a lifetime of chewing hard crusts and roasted grains. But they were not rotting from jelly beans. They were not collapsing beneath the burden of candy. Their mouths may have smelled of garlic and smoke, but they were not riddled with black holes from Skittles and soda pop. Children didn't drink juice boxes. They drank watered ale or fresh spring water. Their snacks were apples, not gummy worms. A sweet treat, a honey cake perhaps, or a tart made with wild berries, might appear at midsummer, or on a wedding table, or during the harvest festival when the last of the year's sweetness was captured and consumed in one celebratory feast. But the other 300 days? Savoury. Bitter, earthy, plain. There were no candy wrappers in a medieval gutter, no jam jars in a peasant's pantry, no shelf of sugar-coated cereal to begin the day. Their mornings began with bread, hard, crusty, often sour, and their evenings ended with stew. Their teeth, in a way, were lucky, not by design, by intention, but by default, by lack, by circumstance. And when pain did come, and it did, it was from wear, not rot, from grinding flour between their teeth. From years of chewing meat on the same side, from biting into something that shouldn't have been bitten, but not from a lollipop, not from soda, not from the quiet everyday sabotage of sugar. In our world, sugar is silent, hidden in sauces, baked into bread, stirred into yogurt. We sip it in coffees, we crave it before bed. It whispers through our diets in ways most of us never notice, until a dentist shows us the damage. But in their world, it was loud, rare, celebrated, feared, and above all, limited. Their diets weren't designed for dental health, but they stumbled into it anyway, through necessity, not knowledge, through hardship, not habit. And their mouths, for all their roughness, were spared the sweet decay that modernity so often brings. So if you ever find yourself thinking of medieval peasants as toothless, gap-mouthed relics, remember this. They may not have brushed, they may not have flossed, but they also didn't drink Coke. And in that way, they may have smiled a little longer than we'd think. In medieval Europe, honey was one of the few accessible sweeteners, but it remained a luxury item for most peasants. While sugar was virtually unheard of outside wealthy households and monastic apothecaries, honey existed more commonly, though not in abundance. Beekeeping was practiced particularly by monasteries and some wealthier estates, but peasant access was limited. When used, honey served primarily for preservation, medicinal purposes, or special feasts, not daily sweetening. The average peasant family did not maintain large apiaries. Even when wild hives were discovered, the honey was collected sparingly, as harvesting could destroy the hive and meant risking stings without protective gear. Moreover, the labour involved made honey a high-value good. Those who kept bees did so cautiously, and most of the honey might be reserved for trading, tithing, or sale, rather than consumption. Honey was sometimes used in feast day foods, often mixed with oats or spiced with herbs, but these events were rare. The liturgical calendar dictated the structure of most meals, and sweetened dishes were associated with festivals, weddings, or major religious observances. In essence, honey was reserved for ritualistic and seasonal purposes, not as a staple. Honey also had a valued place in folk medicine. It was commonly used to treat wounds, aid in digestion, and act as a natural preservative for herbs and fruits. Herbal manuals from the period, such as those influenced by Hildegard of Bingen or Dioscorides, noted honey's healing properties. Peasants might use it in small amounts to coat herbs or to ease throat infections, but rarely more than a spoonful at a time. Because honey was so rarely consumed, it did not contribute significantly to dental caries among peasants. Unlike modern diets, where sugar is consumed in frequent small doses throughout the day in tea, snacks, sauces and cereals, honey's infrequent use meant that the oral bacteria responsible for decay had few opportunities to flourish. Even among the nobility, who had slightly better access to honey and imported sugar, records show that widespread tooth decay was still not a major issue in early medieval periods. It wasn't until the increased availability of sugar in the late medieval and early modern period that noticeable increases in dental issues began to emerge, particularly among the wealthy. In summary, while honey was the most common natural sweetener in medieval Europe, its scarcity, special purpose use and high value kept its consumption minimal among peasants, which directly contributed to lower incidences of tooth decay in this population compared to modern sugar-consuming societies. While medieval peasants lacked access to modern dental tools like toothbrushes, toothpaste or dental floss, their diets provided a form of natural oral hygiene. The foods they consumed on a daily basis, coarse breads, fibrous vegetables, whole grains, and minimally processed meats, offered a surprising benefit: mechanical cleaning of the teeth. This dietary texture, combined with a lack of refined sugars, contributed to a relatively lower occurrence of dental caries compared to populations in later centuries who consumed softer, processed and sugar-rich foods. On the other hand, the cornerstone of the medieval peasant diet was bread. However, it bore little resemblance to the modern store-bought loaf. Peasant bread was commonly made from whole grains such as barley, rye or oats, sometimes maslin, a mix of wheat and rye. White bread, made from finely sifted wheat flour, was reserved for the nobility or clergy, as producing it required additional labour and fine milling. Peasant bread was often stone ground, which meant small fragments of grit from the millstones frequently ended up in the dough. This added to its abrasiveness. The bread was typically baked into dense, thick loaves, sometimes aged until it became hard and dry. It was often eaten days after baking, dipped in broth or beer to soften it. This hardness required considerable chewing and created friction against the surface of the teeth. From a dental perspective, this kind of coarse food had the unintended benefit of scraping away food debris and disrupting early plaque formation. While it wouldn't eliminate bacterial buildup completely, it served as a primitive substitute for brushing, especially when consumed regularly over time. Peasants didn't consume soft or processed grain products like today's refined pasta or white rice. Instead, they often ate whole grains in the form of porridge or gruel. Barley, oats, and millet were staples, typically cooked until thick and chewy. These required prolonged mastication, which not only stimulated saliva production, a natural buffer against acids in the mouth, but also increased contact between fibrous food and the tooth surface. Vegetables were also consumed regularly, though mostly those that grew easily in northern and western European climates. These included leeks, onions, turnips, parsnips, cabbage, carrots, usually purple or white, not orange, broad beans, peas. Many of these vegetables were eaten raw in warmer seasons or lightly boiled when available. The high fibre content in these foods provided texture and resistance, requiring effort to chew and generating more friction against the enamel. Over time, this helped reduce soft food buildup and lessened bacterial stagnation, particularly on the chewing surfaces of molars. Meat consumption was infrequent but not absent from peasant diets. When eaten, meat often came in the form of tough cuts, offal, or dried and salted preparations. These required a great deal of chewing. In some cases, peasants consumed tendons, cartilage, or even small bones, especially in soups or stews. These tough textures forced longer chewing times and created additional contact between food and teeth. Animal sinew, gristle, and skin, while not enjoyable by modern standards, were part of the nose-to-tail eating practice common to lower classes. This practice maximised available nutrition and minimised waste, but it also introduced abrasive and resistant foods that challenged the jaw and offered dental benefits through friction. In addition to meat, dairy products like aged cheese were often quite hard and dense. Cheese was occasionally rubbed on coarse bread or eaten in small quantities. Its salty, grainy texture also contributed to the scrubbing effect, although its overall role was minor compared to plant-based foods. One often overlooked benefit of whole fibrous food is that it stimulates salivary flow. Chewing for extended periods, common with dried bread, raw vegetables, and tough meat, triggers more saliva to be produced. Saliva is crucial in maintaining oral health for several reasons. It washes away food particles, it neutralizes acids produced by bacteria, it delivers minerals like calcium and phosphate to tooth enamel. In medieval peasant diets, chewing was a laborious, time-consuming process. Meals were not eaten quickly, and most dishes required active jaw work. This consistent chewing habit, often multiple times a day, maintained a steady production of saliva and contributed to an internal protective environment in the mouth, even without deliberate oral hygiene practices. Modern diets, by contrast, include many soft, processed foods that require minimal chewing, thus reducing salivary stimulation and increasing the risk of plaque and bacterial proliferation. Peasant meals were often cooked over open flames or in clay ovens, giving bread crusts and vegetables a slightly charred, hardened exterior. Grains might be roasted before grinding, increasing their hardness. Root vegetables were sometimes cooked with skins on or only partially peeled, preserving their rough exterior. Additionally, the absence of modern processing meant food retained more of its natural abrasiveness. There were no industrial mills to refine flour to a powder or machinery to puree vegetables to smooth consistency. Even peasant soups and stews were chunky and coarse, with stringy herbs and fibrous stalks left intact. Over time, these consistent textures contributed to gradual wear of the enamel, but they also delayed or prevented bacterial buildup, especially in the absence of sugar to feed oral bacteria. Wear from natural food friction is significantly less harmful than decay caused by sugar-fed bacteria and acid erosion. While medieval peasants had no access to toothbrushes, floss or mouthwash, their diet unintentionally fulfilled a dual role. It nourished the body and provided constant low-level abrasion that helped maintain oral cleanliness. The prevalence of coarse bread, raw or lightly cooked vegetables, whole grains, and tough meats created an environment where teeth were mechanically scrubbed several times a day. These foods not only cleaned the tooth surface but also required longer chewing, promoting salivary flow and discouraging bacterial colonization. While dental issues like tooth loss from trauma, wear or age were common, the low incidence of sugar and high dietary abrasiveness meant that cavities were relatively rare among the peasant population, particularly when compared to modern societies with softer, more processed, sugar-heavy diets. In short, the medieval peasant didn't need a toothbrush because their diet did much of the work for them. In modern societies, it is easy to forget how drastically food availability has changed over the past several centuries. Today, we can walk into a supermarket at any time of year and buy blueberries, oranges, bananas, mangoes, apples, or grapes, often flown in from distant countries and kept fresh through refrigeration and global shipping infrastructure. But in medieval Europe, food was entirely seasonal and deeply localized. This had profound implications not only for nutrition, but for oral health as well. One of the key reasons medieval peasants experienced relatively low rates of tooth decay was their limited access to sweet or sugary foods, particularly those that are continuously available to modern consumers. Peasant diets were dictated by the natural rhythm of seasons, harvest cycles, religious calendars, and storage capacity, none of which allowed for continuous indulgence in sweet treats. To understand medieval eating patterns, it's important to note agriculture was subsistence-based for the vast majority of the population. Crops were grown locally, eaten fresh in season, and preserved through simple techniques like drying, salting, fermenting, or storing in cellars. If a fruit was not in season, it was simply unavailable. Peasants could not import fruit from warmer climates or preserve large quantities without spoilage. Even apples, one of the more easily stored fruits, could only be kept for a few months in cool, dry storage before rotting. Berries, cherries, plums, pears, and other fruits had to be consumed quickly during harvest, shared among family or community members, or preserved in minimal amounts using honey or vinegar. Without refrigeration, industrial drying techniques, or chemical preservatives, fresh fruits were fleeting. A peasant might enjoy blackberries for a few weeks in summer and not see them again until the following year. In contrast, the modern diet includes sweetened yogurts, fruit juices, jams, dried fruits, pastries, and soft drinks, all of which deliver sugar to the teeth on a daily or hourly basis. The absence of these modern conveniences alone drastically reduced the frequency of sugar exposure among medieval people. While some preservation methods existed, they were resource-intensive and reserved for small quantities. Drying fruit over fires or in the sun was common, but required dry weather and labour. Salting was used for meat and fish, not fruit. Using honey to preserve berries or create syrups was possible but expensive, as honey was itself a valuable commodity. Some monasteries and wealthier households made fruit preserves, especially in the later medieval period, but these were not part of the peasant diet. Even among those who had occasional access to such items, their use was typically medicinal or ceremonial, not everyday indulgence. For most rural families, fruit was consumed fresh and in season. Beyond that, it became a memory. Even sweet baked goods, which modern people consume regularly, were rare in the medieval world. First, access to wheat, the preferred grain for fine soft pastries, was limited to wealthier households. Most peasants ate bread made from barley, oats or rye. Baking required access to ovens, fuel and time, all of which were precious commodities. Most villages had a shared communal oven, and the baking schedule was carefully rotated. Sweet baked goods required refined flour, eggs, milk and sweetener, often all at once, luxuries for the average household. Cakes and pastries were not standard parts of peasant meals. If a sweet bread was made, it was likely done for special occasions, feast days, weddings, or midwinter celebrations. These events were rare, and the baked goods produced were often coarse and only lightly sweetened, sometimes with fruit if it was in season, or honey if it was available. There were no candy shops, no bulk bins of jelly beans, no grocery store cakes, nothing resembling the modern industrial candy supply. In short, there was no infrastructure for daily sweets. In addition to agricultural limits, the Christian religious calendar played a powerful role in shaping medieval diets. The church imposed numerous fasting days throughout the year. During Lent and Advent, and on Fridays and other designated days, people were forbidden from consuming meat, dairy, or sometimes even oil and wine. These periods could last for weeks or months and were observed throughout the Christian world. This religious structure meant that richer foods and indulgent dishes were intentionally limited, even when available. Fasting was a communal, spiritual, and practical experience. For peasants, it meant relying heavily on grains, legumes, and vegetables, foods that were hard, fibrous, and low in sugar. Even feast days, when sweets might be served, were controlled and infrequent. The cycle of fasting and feasting gave very little opportunity for sustained sugar consumption, and even feast foods were modest by modern standards. A fruit tart, a berry pudding, or a honey-glazed bread may have been served, but only once or twice a year. The concept of snacking as we know it today didn't exist for medieval peasants. Meals were typically eaten twice a day, once in mid-morning after a few hours of work, and again in the evening. Food was a communal event, often dependent on the rhythm of labour in the fields or household duties. There were no sugary snack bars to eat on the go, no vending machines, no processed cereal bars, fruit snacks or juice boxes. Between meals, people might drink ale or water and chew on coarse bread if they were hungry. But snacks, in the modern sense, particularly sweet ones, were not a part of daily life. This meant that teeth were not continuously exposed to sugar throughout the day, reducing the number of bacterial acid attacks on the enamel. Fewer eating occasions meant fewer risks for cavities. Unlike today, where children's diets are often loaded with sweetened cereals, candies and fruit juices, medieval children ate the same food as their parents. They were given porridge, bread, vegetables and occasionally scraps of meat or broth. There was no market for kid food loaded with sugar and artificial flavours. This meant that childhood cavities, which are common today due to frequent sugar exposure and poor brushing habits, were relatively less frequent in the medieval peasant population. While other dental issues, like early tooth loss or injury, did occur, children's exposure to sugar was vastly lower than that of the average 21st century child. In many parts of medieval Europe, gluttony was considered not only unhealthy but sinful. Overeating, especially of rich, sweet foods, was condemned by religious and moral authorities. The idea of eating simply, modestly, and only as much as needed was encouraged and sometimes enforced through religious teaching. This cultural context created a food environment where moderation was the default, not the exception. When sweet foods were available, they were consumed with reverence, not routine. The cumulative effect of seasonal eating, limited food preservation, restricted access to sweeteners, religious fasting, cultural attitudes, and lack of processed goods was a naturally low-sugar diet. This meant that oral bacteria had fewer opportunities to produce cavity-causing acids, and enamel was generally subjected to less frequent demineralization. While medieval peasants lacked access to modern dental care, they also avoided the primary dietary cause of dental caries, frequent sustained exposure to refined sugars. Studies of medieval skeletons across Europe have shown that dental decay was present, but less prevalent than in later centuries. For example, archaeological remains from 10th to 13th century England reveal that the majority of adults had some dental wear, some signs of tooth loss and gum disease, but a relatively low rate of cavities, especially among lower-class individuals. Tooth decay became more common after sugar was introduced to Europe in larger quantities during the 16th and 17th centuries. As sugar plantations expanded in the Caribbean and colonial trade brought refined sugar to European markets, dental decay rose significantly, especially among the upper classes who could afford it. The working class followed as industrial food systems developed. In contrast, the medieval peasant diet, though hard, monotonous, and based on survival, accidentally protected oral health in a way modern diets often do not. In a world without refrigerators, without grocery stores, without candy wrappers or flavoured yogurts, sweetness was an event, not a habit. Medieval peasants did not avoid sugar because they understood the science of bacteria or enamel erosion. They avoided it because they had no choice. The land gave them what it could, when it could, and when it couldn't, they waited. That enforced patience, that natural scarcity, that seasonal rhythm. It protected their teeth. No soda, no cookies, no year-round sugar highs. Just porridge, stew, bread, and the long, quiet wait for the berries to ripen again next summer. In evaluating the dental health of medieval peasants, it's important to understand not just what they did eat, but what they couldn't. Among the notable absences in their diet were two highly concentrated sources of natural sugar, molasses and maple syrup. These sweeteners, common in certain parts of the world and widely used in modern times, were completely unknown or inaccessible to the medieval European peasantry. Their absence is another significant reason why oral bacteria had limited sugar to metabolize, reducing acid production and the risk of tooth decay. Without concentrated liquid sweeteners like these, even peasants with occasional access to honey or fruit were rarely tempted or able to consistently consume sugar in its most cavity-causing forms. Molasses is a thick, dark syrup produced during the process of refining sugarcane into crystallized sugar. However, medieval European peasants had no access to molasses for the simple reason that they had no sugarcane. Sugarcane was native to tropical and subtropical regions like India, Southeast Asia, and eventually the Mediterranean and the Canary Islands. But its cultivation in Europe was extremely limited during the medieval period. Moreover, refining sugar required specialized equipment, fuel, and expertise, factors far beyond the reach of rural farming communities. While sugar refining did exist in the Islamic world and some port cities of southern Europe during the later Middle Ages, molasses was not a commodity that circulated in peasant markets or households. It was not a trade item they would recognize, nor a flavor they would be familiar with. Only in the post-medieval era, especially during the 16th and 17th centuries, did molasses become a recognizable byproduct of the Atlantic sugar trade. It was first produced in significant quantities in sugar plantations of the Caribbean, where enslaved labor fueled large-scale production. From there, molasses entered European markets, primarily as a low-cost sweetener and ingredient in rum production. In short, molasses was both chronologically and geographically outside the medieval peasant experience. Maple syrup, though natural and familiar to modern consumers in North America, was entirely unknown in medieval Europe. Indigenous peoples in northeastern North America had long been tapping maple trees and reducing sap into syrup, but Europeans only learned of this process after the beginning of colonization in the 16th and 17th centuries. In the medieval period, European forests were dominated by oak, beech, birch, hazel, ash, and elder, not sugar maples. Even if some maple species were present in parts of Europe, the process of tapping, collecting and boiling sap into syrup was not part of European culinary or agricultural practice. There is no documented use of maple sap as a sweetener in any medieval texts, recipes or herbals. As a result, European peasants of the Middle Ages had no access to, and likely no knowledge of, syrupy tree sap as a food item. The concept of drizzling thick, sweet syrup over bread or porridge would have seemed entirely foreign. Their natural sweeteners, such as honey or ripe fruit, were consumed directly, not refined into concentrated liquids. While molasses and maple syrup were not available, some forms of syrup did exist in medieval Europe, but they were rare and used primarily for medicinal or elite culinary purposes. Apothecaries prepared herbal syrups using honey or imported sugar, sometimes infused with rosewater, violet, anise, or licorice, meant to soothe coughs or aid digestion. These were not taken for pleasure but for health, and only by those who could afford to see a physician. Elite households and monasteries may have prepared fruit syrups, or syrups of sugar mixed with spices like cinnamon or ginger, again for use in special dishes or remedies. But these preparations were time-consuming, labour-intensive and extremely expensive. For peasants, these sweet concoctions were practically invisible, restricted to the realm of the educated and the wealthy. Thus, the idea of regularly consuming sweet syrup as part of a daily or even weekly diet was simply not feasible for the average person. From a dental perspective, one of the most damaging aspects of modern liquid sweeteners is that they coat the teeth and linger, especially if consumed frequently or sipped throughout the day. Drinks and syrups high in sugar, like soda, sports drinks, flavoured coffees, or even juice, create a film that allows oral bacteria to thrive. The bacteria metabolize sugar, producing acids that soften and wear away the enamel, leading to cavities. Molasses and maple syrup, while natural, are extremely high in sugar content and have similar effects when consumed regularly. In modern usage, they're often included in granola bars, sauces, desserts, baked goods, and even health foods, contributing to high levels of hidden sugar in the average diet. Medieval peasants, lacking any equivalent to these products, were simply not exposed to dense, sticky sugars that could sit on teeth and feed acid-producing bacteria for extended periods. Even honey, when available, was often diluted or cooked and not used as a frequent topping or mix-in. Most foods were solid, unprocessed and low in carbohydrates that break down into simple sugars. Therefore, the absence of molasses and maple syrup was not just a matter of culture or geography. It had direct protective effects on oral health. Because these concentrated sweeteners were absent, peasants were not routinely exposed to sugar in a way that created craving or dependence. There is ample evidence today that sugar can be habit-forming, triggering the brain's reward pathways and leading to overconsumption. When people grow up eating sugar-laced cereals, drinks and snacks, their baseline for sweet becomes much higher, and so does their consumption. Medieval peasants had no such baseline. Their palates were accustomed to savoury, sour and bitter flavours. When they did encounter something sweet, a fresh apple, a wild strawberry, a drizzle of honey, it was appreciated but not expected. It was not part of every meal, or even every week. This absence of sweetened syrups and sauces meant less constant stimulation of oral bacteria and less desire to eat in ways that caused dental damage. The medieval peasant's diet was shaped by what was grown, raised or foraged locally. Without trade access to the global sugar economy, they never developed a culinary culture that included molasses or maple syrup. These products were either geographically irrelevant or technologically impossible during their time. As a result, peasants did not consume sticky, sugary liquids that coat teeth, feed bacteria, and erode enamel. The sweet tooth that defines so much of modern food culture simply didn't exist in the same way. What they lacked in luxury, they gained in protection. Their enamel was not softened by caramelized glazes or drowned in pancake syrup. Their mouths were rough, weathered and imperfect, but in many ways more resilient than ours. In the absence of modern dental tools, early societies had to rely, consciously or not, on the mechanical action of the foods they ate to help maintain basic oral hygiene. For medieval peasants, one of the simplest but most effective tools for cleaning teeth was not a brush, nor a cloth, nor even an herbal rinse. It was raw, fibrous vegetables. Their coarse textures and high fibre content functioned as a natural scrub for the teeth, helping to disrupt plaque, remove food debris, and stimulate the gums. Peasant diets were rooted in necessity, and raw vegetables played an essential role, not just nutritionally, but physically, in maintaining oral cleanliness. Unlike wealthier classes who could afford to cook vegetables in meat stocks or flavoured broths, peasants often consumed vegetables raw or lightly boiled, especially during the spring and summer months when firewood was scarce or meals were rushed. Root vegetables, leaves, and stalks were frequently eaten straight from the field or garden. In areas of Europe where fuel was limited or expensive, firewood was conserved for necessary cooking, like porridge or bread, and heating. As a result, not every vegetable was thoroughly cooked. Turnips, carrots, parsnips, leeks, and onions might be chopped into stews, but they were just as often eaten raw as part of a midday snack or added last minute to a meal, allowing them to retain their fibrous structure. The chewing of these tough fibrous vegetables required effort, producing a cleaning effect similar to the mild abrasion of brushing. Fibrous vegetables like raw cabbage, leeks, wild greens, or root vegetables possess tough cell walls and rough surfaces. When chewed, these textures create friction against tooth enamel. This friction helps physically scrape away soft debris, early-stage plaque, and lingering food particles that might otherwise stick between the teeth or along the gum line. Modern dental science acknowledges that texture matters. Soft, sticky foods tend to cling to the tooth surface and contribute to bacterial growth, while coarse foods tend to dislodge debris and clean the surface more effectively. Raw vegetables like celery and carrots are often recommended today for their ability to scrub teeth and promote chewing. Medieval peasants, without knowing the science, benefited from this mechanism through daily diet alone. Chewing fibrous foods stimulates salivary glands, increasing the production of saliva, which plays a key role in oral health. Saliva contains bicarbonate, calcium and phosphate, substances that neutralize acids, buffer oral pH, and help remineralize tooth enamel. In modern times, people chew gum or use sugar-free mints to promote saliva flow. But in the medieval world, chewing raw vegetables served a similar function. The act of breaking down tough plant matter required extended chewing time, giving the body more opportunity to produce saliva and flush away bacteria or small food remnants. It wasn't intentional dental care, but it was effective. While roots and tubers offered broad abrasion, leafy greens and fibrous stalks had a different function. Foods like chard, wild spinach, nettles, dandelion leaves, and even cabbage could get caught between the teeth, and in the process help to push out other debris. These softer fibrous materials also cleaned surfaces that chewing alone might miss, especially in the crevices between molars or under the gum line. The regular consumption of such roughage helped to manually disrupt the growth of plaque biofilms, making it harder for harmful bacteria to establish colonies. Even if the food was later rinsed with ale or swallowed with coarse bread, the chewing of raw plants played a small but continuous role in cleaning and conditioning the mouth. In addition to cultivated crops, peasants relied heavily on foraged greens and wild plants to supplement their diets, especially during spring and early summer, when winter stores had been exhausted and fields had not yet yielded their full harvest. These included sorrel wild garlic, watercress, chickweed, plantain, not the banana type, wood sorrel, ground elder. These plants were chewy, bitter, and full of fibre. Some, like wood sorrel and sorrel, also contained natural acids, like oxalic acid, that had a mild astringent or cleansing effect. Others were used not only as food, but as folk remedies for oral pain or inflammation. Foraged greens were often eaten raw in small quantities, either alone or with coarse bread. Though bitter and sometimes difficult to digest, they played a critical role in scraping the teeth and stimulating the gums, especially after long winters when oral hygiene had likely been neglected. Archaeological studies of medieval skeletons have confirmed that dental wear, especially on the molars, was common due to the abrasive nature of food and stone-ground bread. However, dental caries, cavities, were less common among rural peasants than among later populations exposed to refined sugar and soft processed foods. One contributing factor to this pattern is the consistent mechanical cleaning provided by the peasant diet. Raw vegetables, seeds, and tough plant matter did not allow food to sit undisturbed on teeth, nor did it allow soft plaque to remain in place for long periods of time. Every meal, by its very nature, provided a low-grade cleaning event. Of course, this came at a cost. Enamel was worn down gradually, and tooth exposure and sensitivity were likely common in older individuals. Still, compared to the sugar-induced decay seen in early modern and industrial populations, medieval tooth wear was a less painful and slower developing problem. Raw vegetables, foraged plants, and fibrous greens weren't just survival food. They were, however, unintentionally part of a primitive oral hygiene routine. Chewed daily, they scraped plaque, stimulated saliva, disrupted bacteria, cleared food debris, all without requiring a brush, rinse, or dental floss. While peasants had little understanding of bacteria or decay, their bodies benefited from the mechanical advantages of unprocessed, high-fibre foods. Today's dental professionals encourage us to eat crunchy vegetables and raw greens for the same reason. The medieval peasant didn't just survive on root vegetables, they cleaned their teeth with them. The medieval peasant's diet was shaped by what was grown, raised, or foraged locally. Without trade access to the global sugar economy, they never developed a culinary culture that included molasses or maple syrup. These products were either geographically irrelevant or technologically impossible during their time. As a result, peasants did not consume sticky, sugary liquids that coat teeth, feed bacteria, and erode enamel. The sweet tooth that defines so much of modern food culture simply didn't exist in the same way. What they lacked in luxury, they gained in protection. Their enamel was not softened by caramelized glazes or drowned in pancake syrup. Their mouths were rough, weathered, and imperfect, but in many ways more resilient than ours. In the absence of modern dental tools, early societies had to rely, consciously or not, on the mechanical action of the foods they ate to help maintain basic oral hygiene. For medieval peasants, one of the simplest but most effective tools for cleaning teeth was not a brush, nor a cloth, nor even an herbal rinse. It was raw, fibrous vegetables. Their coarse textures and high fibre content functioned as a natural scrub for the teeth, helping to disrupt plaque, remove food debris, and stimulate the gums. Peasant diets were rooted in necessity, and raw vegetables played an essential role, not just nutritionally, but physically, in maintaining oral cleanliness. Unlike wealthier classes who could afford to cook vegetables in meat stocks or flavoured broths, peasants often consumed vegetables raw or lightly boiled, especially during the spring and summer months when firewood was scarce or meals were rushed. Root vegetables, leaves, and stalks were frequently eaten straight from the field or garden. In areas of Europe where fuel was limited or expensive, firewood was conserved for necessary cooking, like porridge or bread, and heating. As a result, not every vegetable was thoroughly cooked. Turnips, carrots, parsnips, leeks, and onions might be chopped into stews, but they were just as often eaten raw as part of a midday snack or added last minute to a meal, allowing them to retain their fibrous structure. The chewing of these tough fibrous vegetables required effort, producing a cleaning effect similar to the mild abrasion of brushing. Fibrous vegetables like raw cabbage, leeks, wild greens, or root vegetables possess tough cell walls and rough surfaces. When chewed, these textures create friction against tooth enamel. This friction helps physically scrape away soft debris, early-stage plaque, and lingering food particles that might otherwise stick between the teeth or along the gum line. Modern dental science acknowledges that texture matters. Soft, sticky foods tend to cling to the tooth surface and contribute to bacterial growth, while coarse foods tend to dislodge debris and clean the surface more effectively. Raw vegetables like celery and carrots are often recommended today for their ability to scrub teeth and promote chewing. Medieval peasants, without knowing the science, benefited from this mechanism through daily diet alone. Chewing fibrous foods stimulates salivary glands, increasing the production of saliva, which plays a key role in oral health. Saliva contains bicarbonate, calcium, and phosphate, substances that neutralize acids, buffer oral pH, and help remineralize tooth enamel. In modern times, people chew gum or use sugar-free mints to promote saliva flow. But in the medieval world, chewing raw vegetables served a similar function. The act of breaking down tough plant matter required extended chewing time, giving the body more opportunity to produce saliva and flush away bacteria or small food remnants. It wasn't intentional dental care, but it was effective. While roots and tubers offered broad abrasion, leafy greens and fibrous stalks had a different function. Foods like chard, wild spinach, nettles, dandelion leaves, and even cabbage could get caught between the teeth, and in the process help to push out other debris. These softer fibrous materials also cleaned surfaces that chewing alone might miss, especially in the crevices between molars or under the gum line. The regular consumption of such roughage helped to manually disrupt the growth of plaque biofilms, making it harder for harmful bacteria to establish colonies. Even if the food was later rinsed with ale or swallowed with coarse bread, the chewing of raw plants played a small but continuous role in cleaning and conditioning the mouth. In addition to cultivated crops, peasants relied heavily on foraged greens and wild plants to supplement their diets, especially during spring and early summer, when winter stores had been exhausted and fields had not yet yielded their full harvest. These included sorrel wild garlic, watercress, chickweed, plantain, not the banana type, wood sorrel, ground elder. These plants were chewy, bitter, and full of fibre. Some, like wood sorrel and sorrel, also contained natural acids, like oxalic acid, that had a mild astringent or cleansing effect. Others were used not only as food, but as folk remedies for oral pain or inflammation. Foraged greens were often eaten raw in small quantities, either alone or with coarse bread. Though bitter and sometimes difficult to digest, they played a critical role in scraping the teeth and stimulating the gums, especially after long winters when oral hygiene had likely been neglected. Archaeological studies of medieval skeletons have confirmed that dental wear, especially on the molars, was common due to the abrasive nature of food and stone-ground bread. However, dental caries, cavities, were less common among rural peasants than among later populations exposed to refined sugar and soft processed foods. One contributing factor to this pattern is the consistent mechanical cleaning provided by the peasant diet. Raw vegetables, seeds, and tough plant matter did not allow food to sit undisturbed on teeth, nor did it allow soft plaque to remain in place for long periods of time. Every meal, by its very nature, provided a low-grade cleaning event. Of course, this came at a cost. Enamel was worn down gradually, and tooth exposure and sensitivity were likely common in older individuals. Still, compared to the sugar-induced decay seen in early modern and industrial populations, medieval tooth wear was a less painful and slower developing problem. Raw vegetables, foraged plants, and fibrous greens weren't just survival food. They were, however, unintentionally part of a primitive oral hygiene routine. Chewed daily, they scraped plaque, stimulated saliva, disrupted bacteria, cleared food debris, all without requiring a brush, rinse, or dental floss. While peasants had little understanding of bacteria or decay, their bodies benefited from the mechanical advantages of unprocessed, high-fibre foods. Today's dental professionals encourage us to eat crunchy vegetables and raw greens for the same reason. The medieval peasant didn't just survive on root vegetables, they cleaned their teeth with them. Bread was not just a staple, it was the cornerstone of the peasant diet. For most people living in rural villages, bread constituted the bulk of their daily calories, often eaten at every meal. But this bread was nothing like the soft, fluffy loaves familiar to modern grocery shoppers. Instead, it was hard, coarse and dense, made from whole grains that included a significant amount of bran, husk, and stone-ground grit. While medieval bread lacked modern enrichment, preservatives, or yeast-leavened softness, it brought with it an unintentional benefit. It helped clean teeth. The physical act of chewing such coarse bread functioned as a kind of mechanical toothbrush, scraping plaque and soft debris from the teeth and acting as a daily abrasive agent. The typical peasant in northern Europe consumed rye, barley, or oats, depending on local climate and availability. In southern regions, wheat was sometimes grown, but it was expensive and rarely accessible to the poor. As a result, fine white bread made from sifted flour called manchet was a product of the nobility or monastery kitchens. Peasants ate maslin, a mixture of wheat and rye, barley bread or rye alone, with the flour rarely, if ever, sifted. Most households ground their own grain or brought it to the local manorial mill, which was often inefficient and produced flour that retained sharp particles of stone and grit from the millstones. This included quartz or granite fragments, depending on the material used. Over time, this gritty bread wore down teeth through continuous exposure to these microscopic abrasives. Modern commercial flour is roller milled and refined to remove the outer husk of the grain. But in the medieval period, stone milling was the norm. This process ground the entire kernel, bran, germ and endosperm, into a dense flour full of fibrous bran, and often bits of stone or sand. There was no bleaching, no bolting, sifting out fine particles, and no concern for dental comfort. The bran layer in particular is high in lignin and cellulose, which are fibrous and rough. Eating bread that included bran not only required more chewing, but also introduced a textured material into the mouth that could gently scrape at plaque, especially along the molars and gum line. Combined with unintentional grit from the millstones, each bite acted like fine sandpaper, removing soft build-up from the surface of the teeth. Peasants ate bread at every meal. It was often dunked into weak ale or broth, eaten with hard cheese or raw onions, used as a utensil for scooping or soaking up stew. But even when softened slightly, the mechanical action of chewing remained a constant. Bread crusts were particularly firm and could remain hard for days. In some cases, old bread was repurposed as trencher bread, a thick slice used as a plate, which would absorb sauces or meat juices and then be eaten or fed to animals. As a result, teeth were exposed daily to rough, fibrous foods with embedded grit and plant matter. This exposure functions similarly to a toothbrush and floss, albeit more primitive. Archaeological evidence supports the idea that medieval people experienced significant tooth wear over time. Skeletal remains often show flattened molars, worn enamel, and exposure of dentin, the inner layer of the tooth. However, despite this wear, cavities were far less common among rural peasants than among populations after the sugar trade expanded in the early modern period. A 2004 study in the Journal of Archaeological Science examining 400 medieval skulls from rural cemeteries in England found that while enamel wear was nearly universal in adults, only 8 to 10% showed evidence of carious lesions, far lower than in post-1600 populations. The researchers noted that this was consistent with diets low in fermentable sugar and high in coarse plant foods. Other studies have shown that grit in bread flour was the leading cause of tooth wear during this era. In particular, individuals who lived near older mills with rougher stones had greater wear. Nonetheless, the physical rubbing action of food on teeth kept plaque and soft decay in check. It's worth noting that while coarse bread helped prevent cavities, it was not without consequences. Over time, the continuous grinding of grit-filled food against enamel led to tooth sensitivity, exposure of dentin, tooth shortening, jaw strain in older individuals. However, these conditions are generally less painful and less infectious than large untreated cavities. While tooth wear can lead to discomfort, it rarely leads to systemic infection, unlike decayed or abscessed teeth. In a society with no dentists, antibiotics or dental surgery, wear was a less dangerous price to pay than decay. There is limited evidence that medieval people understood the relationship between food texture and oral hygiene. However, some monastic texts and herbal manuals mention the benefit of coarse food in keeping the mouth fresh or strengthening the teeth. In particular, bread made from barley or oats was seen as healthier than refined wheat, not only for the stomach, but for overall strength. Medieval physicians such as Avicenna and Hildegard of Bingen wrote about the body in holistic terms. Coarse bread was believed to be cleansing, and foods that required strong chewing were thought to build strength and stamina. Though not a modern dental perspective, this belief aligned with the practical reality that coarse food helped keep teeth relatively clean. In addition to being eaten, bread was sometimes used directly as a cleaning aid. Folk practices in parts of Europe included using burnt breadcrumbs mixed with salt or sage as a tooth powder or paste. While not common across all regions, This reflects a growing understanding that food itself, especially its coarser parts, could serve hygienic functions. Likewise, bread crusts or stale crumbs were sometimes chewed as a method to sharpen the teeth or reduce foul breath. The act of chewing dry bread, especially on an empty stomach, was believed to help scrub the mouth before meals. These practices, while not universal, suggest bread had a dual role, nourishing and cleansing, particularly in the absence of specialised tools. Medieval peasants didn't think of bread as a dental aid, but that's exactly what it was. The coarse, fibrous and gritty texture of their daily loaves performed a mechanical function that helped prevent cavities, clear plaque and maintain oral health. Their teeth may have been worn, yellowed or misaligned, but they were often intact, free from deep decay and functional into old age. This outcome wasn't due to any intentional brushing or flossing. It was a direct result of what they ate and how they ate it. Bread, the most ordinary of foods, became a daily dental tool, keeping mouths cleaner than we might expect in a time before fluoride, dentists, or toothpaste. In a world where toothbrushes were non-existent and dental care was limited to folk remedies or sheer luck, what peasants ate turned out to be one of the most significant contributors to oral health. Among the many overlooked aspects of the medieval diet was the way grains and seeds, those simple everyday staples, played a surprisingly effective role in cleaning teeth. Far from just fueling the body, these coarse, chewy foods also helped maintain dental hygiene through their natural abrasiveness and mechanical action in the mouth. Grains were the cornerstone of the peasant diet, dominating meals in both rural and urban areas. Depending on geography and soil conditions, people subsisted on barley, oats, rye, millet, and occasionally spelt or wheat. Unlike today's highly processed and refined grains, medieval grains were eaten whole or minimally ground, meaning that the outer layers of the kernel, the bran and husk, remained intact in most preparations. These parts were fibrous, tough, and full of texture, making the act of chewing a truly physical effort. The bread made from such flour was dense and crusty, and porridges were chewy, sometimes gritty, and far from the soft fare we might expect. Whether boiled into thick gruel or baked into a dry loaf, these grain products acted as abrasives in the mouth. They rubbed against the teeth, scrubbing away bits of stuck food and soft plaque, much in the way a modern toothbrush or dental scrub might do. In addition to grains, seeds formed an important, if less discussed, element of the medieval diet. These included flaxseed, hempseed, caraway, coriander, fennel and mustard seed, each of which found its way into breads, herb mixes, stews and folk remedies. Seeds were often chewed after meals, not necessarily for dental reasons, but to settle the stomach or freshen the breath. Fennel, for example, was commonly used across Europe in this way. Yet, the act of chewing these tiny hard objects served an additional function. Their small size allowed them to reach between the teeth, working into the spaces where food debris might lodge and gently forcing it out. This action is not unlike what modern dental floss achieves, though far less intentional. The chewing of seeds provided a sort of natural interdental cleaning, working between crevices and disturbing bacterial colonies that would otherwise cling undisturbed. Many meals, particularly for the lower classes, revolved around long chewing. With little access to soft foods or meats, peasants spent more time masticating than modern people do today. The hard textures of their food required effort, and that effort stimulated saliva flow, another important contributor to oral health. Saliva is the body's natural mouthwash. It flushes out food particles, neutralizes harmful acids produced by bacteria, and contains essential minerals like calcium and phosphate that aid in maintaining tooth enamel. So in a way, every long chew on oatcake or spoonful of boiled barley not only filled a hungry stomach, but also rinsed and scrubbed the mouth. Foraging was a regular part of rural life, especially in lean seasons. Peasants would collect seeds from wild plants like lamb's quarters, dock or sorrel and add them to their meals. These wild seeds, often chewed whole, had tough outer shells and required significant grinding by the teeth. Their texture and structure encouraged more chewing and added to the cumulative abrasive effect. Even without understanding the microbiology of tooth decay, medieval people were inadvertently protecting their dental health through these simple dietary habits. Archaeological studies of medieval skeletons have consistently supported this idea. Dental remains from rural cemeteries in England, Scandinavia and Central Europe often show considerable wear on molars, flattened chewing surfaces and exposed dentin due to years of abrasive eating. But while the wear is clear, what's equally noticeable is the relatively low incidence of cavities. Unlike modern populations, where sugar and constant snacking create conditions ripe for decay, medieval peasants had far fewer carious lesions. Teeth may have been ground down over decades, but they were generally free from deep cavities, abscesses, or the kind of infection that would have caused tooth loss or systemic illness. Even in the writings of medieval physicians and herbalists, there's some recognition of the link between coarse food and oral health. Though described through the lens of humoral theory or religious beliefs, figures like Hildegard of Bingen and Avicenna referenced foods that kept the mouth clean and gums healthy. Fennel and caraway seeds were praised not only for aiding digestion, but for their effects on breath and the condition of the mouth. The precise reasons weren't known, but the results were noticed, and such seeds remained common household items across medieval Europe. Meals were often shared from communal bowls, eaten with hands or hunks of bread, and accompanied by long periods of chewing. With few utensils and no elaborate cutlery, food had to be soft enough to eat by hand, but sturdy enough to survive preparation without refrigeration or delicate treatment. This meant that dishes were hearty, chewy, and fibrous, ideal for keeping the jaw engaged and the mouth in motion. As people chewed through their meals, especially those made with mixed grains or seed-thickened pottage, their teeth were subjected to a gentle, constant cleaning process that disrupted plaque formation and cleared away hidden residue. Though the effects of this kind of food on teeth weren't fully understood at the time, medieval society did acknowledge the value of coarse bread and rough fare in promoting bodily health. In monastic texts and folk sayings alike, there are mentions of how strong food cleansed the mouth or kept the body firm. Bread made from barley or rye was thought more wholesome than that made from sifted white flour, not only because it was more filling, but because it was more natural, more real. That sentiment, though couched in religious or philosophical language, was grounded in a daily experience that helped preserve the health of those who lived by the land. It's worth mentioning that while grains and seeds helped clean teeth, they also caused tooth wear. Some medieval bread flour was so poorly milled that it included stone particles from the grinding process. Over time, these would erode enamel, making teeth sensitive and exposing the underlying dentin. But this type of wear, while uncomfortable in older age, was rarely as dangerous as a festering cavity. Worn teeth could still function. Decayed or infected teeth, on the other hand, could lead to death in a time without antibiotics. So in the balance between natural cleaning and abrasive damage, medieval peasants may have suffered some discomfort, but were largely spared the most dangerous outcomes. In their own way, medieval peasants followed a kind of natural dental hygiene routine, not through brushes or pastes, but through daily habits built around the physical nature of their food. Every bite of porridge or seed-laced stew was a chance to clean. Every jaw-cramping chew on dry rye crust was another scrubbing session. And in the background, saliva kept flowing, debris was pushed loose, and gums were massaged by textures that modern diets rarely replicate. The humble grain and the unassuming seed didn't just nourish medieval bodies, they protected medieval teeth. With each meal, without knowing it, peasants were flossing, rinsing and scrubbing in ways that worked, primitive by modern standards, but undeniably effective in their time. In the medieval peasant's diet, meat was a rare and valuable commodity. It was not a daily staple, but when it appeared on the table, often in the form of tough cuts, aged joints or small bones, it demanded hard chewing and significant effort to consume. This act of gnawing, tearing and grinding fibrous animal tissue, along with cracking or sucking on bones for marrow or flavour, played an unexpected role in maintaining oral health. While peasants lacked toothbrushes, pastes or dental tools, the physical labour of eating their occasional meat acted as a natural scrubber, pushing the limits of their jaw strength and inadvertently cleansing their teeth and gums. When meat did appear in a peasant household, it was almost never the tender, well-marbled kind enjoyed by the nobility. The average peasant might eat preserved pork belly, salted mutton, or dried strips of beef. Fresh meat was typically reserved for holidays or large gatherings, and even then it might be stew meat from older animals or organ meats with sinew, gristle, and skin still attached. These cuts were not only chewy and fibrous, but often had to be cooked for hours to be considered edible, and even then they retained a toughness that modern consumers would find challenging. This toughness required long chewing times, especially when knives were dull or absent and utensils scarce. Many people simply bit into their food and tore it apart with their teeth, which meant that teeth played an even larger role in food processing than they do today. The effort required to eat these meats promoted two things simultaneously: mechanical cleaning and enhanced saliva production. As meat fibres dragged across the surface of the teeth, they would dislodge residual food particles stuck between teeth or along the gum line. This action did not eliminate all build-up, of course, but it prevented prolonged stagnation of food debris that could otherwise serve as fuel for bacteria. It also stimulated salivary glands, as sustained chewing increases the flow of saliva, a critical part of the body's natural defense against tooth decay. Saliva contains enzymes like amylase and lysozyme that help break down food, control microbial growth, and maintain a balanced pH in the mouth. For peasants without any concept of plaque or enamel, this saliva generation was an unrecognised but important contributor to oral health. Bones, too, were part of the culinary landscape. While wealthier households might strip meat clean and discard the carcass, peasants made full use of every edible component. Bones were boiled for stock, but they were also chewed to extract marrow or to loosen any remaining fat and meat. Gnawing on bones was not simply a luxury but a necessity. It was wasteful to discard something with any remaining nourishment. In this act of gnawing, the hard, calcified surface of bone came into frequent contact with the chewing edges of teeth. This was particularly true for front teeth and molars, which would be used to crack, pry, and strip bones bare. This repetitive, abrasive contact worked to scrape away soft plaque and reduce early tartar formation. Like seeds or coarse grains, bones created friction in the mouth, which helped disturb bacterial colonies and promote cleaner tooth surfaces. The archaeological record supports this dietary pattern. Analysis of skeletal remains from medieval rural graveyards shows significant wear on teeth, not just from gritty bread flour, but from gnawing and tearing. Flattened molars and beveled incisors indicate a lifetime of chewing tough substances. Enamel wear was common, but cavities were less so, particularly in comparison to early modern and industrial populations. Where cavities did appear, they were more often located near the roots or in areas associated with extreme age, rather than from routine bacterial decay caused by sugar. This supports the view that while tooth wear was significant, it was not pathological. Peasants' teeth were functional and, for the most part, pain-free well into adulthood. The kinds of meats they consumed and the manner in which they consumed them played a part in this outcome. It's also important to note that tools for cutting and processing meat were limited in many households. Knives were often shared, dull, or reserved for communal use. This meant that people tore at meat with their hands and mouths, and bones were not always neatly cracked or split ahead of time. The mouth was thus a key instrument in breaking down food, and the teeth bore the brunt of this labour. With this came the unintentional benefit of constant oral stimulation. Muscles were exercised, gums were compressed and massaged, and teeth were subjected to a variety of textures and pressures, all of which helped maintain oral circulation and prevent stagnation, inflammation, or atrophy. The relationship between diet and dental health was also shaped by how meat was preserved. Most meat was salted, smoked, or dried, techniques that toughened the flesh and required even more vigorous chewing. Salted meats, though high in sodium, were chewy and leathery, and required a grinding motion that helped physically clean the back teeth. Smoked meats, too, took on a fibrous texture that could only be softened with long stewing, but when eaten cold or dry, they acted like jerky, stringy and hard. These meats could stick in teeth, but also pulled out debris as people chewed through the fibrous strands. The repetitive act of breaking down such preserved meat mimicked the action of modern chewing gum, except with the added benefit of mechanical scraping. In periods of scarcity, bones were boiled repeatedly until soft, but even then, peasants might chew on softened ends or cartilage. Collagen-rich parts, such as tendons or skin, were cooked into soups, but often eaten directly from the bone. Teeth were used to strip, scrape and gnaw, a practice that encouraged full mouth involvement and furthered cleaning through friction. Children grew up with these habits as well, gnawing on bits of bone or crusted meat in imitation of their elders. It was a family-wide, everyday ritual that contributed to shared dietary habits and shared oral health benefits. Even beyond household consumption, meat shared during feasts, festivals and communal events was often tough and aged. A cow slaughtered for a village celebration might be old or lean, and the meat would be cooked in large batches, overcooked in some places, undercooked in others. People tore meat from bone using teeth, sucked the marrow out of ribs or cracked poultry legs with their molars. These occasions were not only cultural or spiritual, they were also dental workouts. Though nobody attending a midsummer feast thought of it in these terms, the act of chewing and gnawing was working their oral environment in much the same way a modern dental cleaning would. Less precise, perhaps, but more frequent. One cannot overstate the contrast with modern food habits. Today, most meat is tenderized, boneless, pre-sliced, and often consumed with utensils that prevent any direct mouth contact with tough components. The result is less engagement of the jaw, less natural abrasion, and more residual food left undisturbed in the mouth. For medieval peasants, the inverse was true. Every encounter with meat or bone demanded their teeth be used fully, pushing food around the entire mouth, activating different surfaces and continuously dislodging whatever didn't belong. This is not to say medieval peasants had flawless teeth or lived free of oral pain. They dealt with abscesses, lost teeth from trauma, and wore down their enamel prematurely. But on the whole, their diets, meat included, promoted a form of passive dental care through constant use, friction and stimulation. Tough meat and bones weren't just food, they were unintentional tools in the lifelong maintenance of the medieval mouth. In an age before floss and fluoride, the daily struggle to chew was in its own way a saving grace. Whether grinding through tough bread crusts, fibrous vegetables, dried meats or unhulled grains, the act of eating was inherently physical. Teeth were not mere tools for breaking down food. They were daily labourers called into constant action, and the jaw muscles were persistently engaged in a repetitive, intense process that modern diets rarely replicate. This vigorous use of the mouth promoted both dental cleanliness and muscular health in ways that, while unintentional, were profoundly beneficial. The cornerstone of this constant engagement was the texture and structure of medieval food. The bulk of a peasant's calories came from hard grains, often ground roughly between millstones that left small bits of stone or grit in the flour. Bread made from this flour was dense, flat, and frequently dry. Unlike the fluffy loaves found in modern bakeries, medieval bread was stiff and resistant, sometimes requiring dipping into broth or ale to soften it. Chewing it demanded more than a few bites. It involved prolonged grinding, often with considerable jaw force. Eating was not done quickly. A meal might be consumed slowly over time, not because of etiquette, but because the food physically required it. This extended chewing effort kept the jaws active for long periods, stimulating the gums and encouraging saliva production. Jaw movement was integral not only to processing food, but also to maintaining a healthy mouth environment. The very act of mastication increased blood flow to the jawbone and the tissues surrounding the teeth. This circulation helped keep gums firm and reduce the likelihood of gingivitis or inflammation. It also supported the health of the periodontal ligament, the connective tissue that anchors the teeth to the jaw. In an age without dental surgeries, implants, or orthodontics, strong ligaments and jawbones were critical. By continuously working these structures through meals, medieval people were unknowingly exercising and preserving the very components that kept their teeth in place. Saliva, too, played a vital role in this system. Chewing for extended periods stimulates salivary glands, ensuring a constant flow of fluid that performs several important functions. Saliva neutralizes the acids produced by oral bacteria, washes away food particles, and contains enzymes like lysozyme that help manage microbial populations. The longer and more forceful the chewing, the more saliva is produced, and the more thoroughly the mouth is rinsed with every bite. In the absence of modern mouthwash or dental sprays, this natural rinse cycle was essential for preventing bacterial buildup and decay. The foods themselves provided resistance training for the jaw. Raw vegetables, such as onions, carrots, and turnips, were often consumed without cooking or with only light steaming, especially during warmer months or in poorer households without access to ample firewood. These vegetables required firm bites and repeated grinding. Dried legumes, including peas, lentils, and fava beans, were staples, and while stewed for digestibility, they retained a texture that demanded mastication. Even fruits like apples and pears, when not completely ripe, contributed to the workload. Nothing about medieval food was soft or convenient. The diet required engagement, attention, and the use of all chewing surfaces. This extensive jaw use had long-term effects. Archaeological remains show that many medieval individuals, especially those living rural, physically demanding lives, had well-developed mandibles and pronounced muscle attachment points along the lower jaw. These signs are consistent with frequent and forceful chewing. Unlike modern populations, where softer diets lead to underdeveloped jaws, crowded teeth, and orthodontic problems, medieval mouths adapted to the rigors of daily eating. The alignment of teeth, while not cosmetically perfect, was often functional. Teeth wore down evenly due to consistent use, and the spacing between them allowed debris to pass more freely, reducing the chances of decay. The effort required to chew also played a role in overall health beyond the mouth. A well-exercised jaw supported better digestion. Food that is chewed thoroughly before swallowing is more easily broken down in the stomach, and the activation of digestive enzymes begins in the mouth itself. For a medieval peasant, whose meals often lacked complexity but demanded labour, thorough chewing ensured maximum nutrient extraction from each morsel. This may have been especially critical during seasons of scarcity, when every calorie counted and every bite had to be fully processed for survival. Children, too, were introduced to this routine early. From a young age, they gnawed on crusts, roots, and bones, developing strong bite patterns and resilient gums. This early conditioning may have helped shape the strength and endurance of their jaw muscles throughout life. The family table was not only a place of nourishment, but of physiological development, as the act of eating prepared the mouth for a lifetime of service. There were, of course, drawbacks. Excessive chewing over decades led to dental wear, the slow erosion of enamel, and eventually the exposure of dentin. Medieval skulls often display heavily worn molars and flattened cusp patterns, indicative of long-term friction. Yet this wear, while potentially leading to tooth sensitivity or discomfort in old age, was rarely accompanied by infection or widespread cavities. The trade-off between enamel wear and bacterial decay was one that medieval diets managed to navigate surprisingly well. A mouthful of ground-down teeth was still preferable to one riddled with caries and abscesses, which could lead to sepsis or death in a time without antibiotics. Culturally, the act of chewing was so normalized and omnipresent that it rarely received direct commentary. But medieval texts do make passing references to tough food, strong jaws, and the labor of eating. Folk proverbs in several European languages reference chewing as a metaphor for persistence, strength, or humility. Meals weren't scarfed down, they were worked through. The very act of eating reinforced a daily rhythm of physical effort, and that effort shaped the health of the individual, tooth by tooth. Modern science has begun to rediscover what medieval peasants lived out each day, that chewing is not just a minor part of eating, but a crucial aspect of health. Contemporary studies show that diets requiring more chewing lead to greater satiety, better digestion, and improved dental outcomes. And yet, in our current food environment, much of this has been lost. Foods are processed, textures are smoothed, and chewing has been minimized, leading to underdeveloped jaws, crowded teeth, and a surge in orthodontic interventions. In contrast, The medieval peasant, though often underfed and overworked, maintained a mouth shaped and preserved by effort. The daily workout provided by chewing was a silent protector of oral health. It strengthened jaws, supported circulation, activated enzymes and prevented stagnation. It made use of natural materials, seeds, grains, crusts, meat, as unintentional dental tools. It replaced the modern regimen of brushing and rinsing with a built-in system of cleansing through contact and motion. Though they knew nothing of bacteria, plaque, or fluoride, medieval peasants kept their mouths cleaner and more functional than we might assume, simply because their lives required it. So while the idea of fitness today might bring to mind jogging or lifting weights, for the medieval peasant, one of their most consistent daily workouts came from sitting down at the table. And in the rhythmic grind of their jaws, they weren't just breaking down food. They were preserving the very teeth that made it possible to eat again tomorrow. In the absence of toothbrushes, toothpaste, and the modern concept of oral hygiene, medieval people, especially rural peasants, turned to the natural world for functional solutions. Among the most enduring and practical tools they adopted were chewing sticks from specific types of wood, including hazelwood, willow, and ash. These natural implements were neither ornamental nor ceremonial. They were used out of necessity, familiarity, and simple trial and error over generations. Though rarely written about in official documents or preserved in museum collections, their existence is supported by references in folklore, scattered archaeological evidence, and ethnographic continuities that stretch back thousands of years. Hazelwood was perhaps the most accessible and widely used among the three. It grows quickly, bends easily, and produces smooth, fibrous twigs that lend themselves well to repetitive chewing without splintering dangerously. In many parts of medieval Europe, hazel was already valued for its flexible branches, which were used in wattle fencing, baskets, and fish traps. Its availability meant that it was familiar to both children and adults alike, and its soft inner fibres could be exposed by chewing or light carving. A peasant might snap off a fresh twig, peel the bark with a knife or teeth, and chew one end until it frayed into a brush-like tuft. This softened bundle of fibres could then be rubbed along the surfaces of the teeth or gently moved along the gum line. While the practice lacked the finesse of modern brushing, it provided mechanical abrasion that helped dislodge food particles, disturb bacterial colonies, and clean the mouth with surprising effectiveness. Willow branches offered similar advantages, but with added benefits. Willow bark contains salicin, a natural compound that would later become the basis for aspirin. Though medieval peasants didn't understand this compound on a chemical level, they certainly recognized willow's soothing and mildly numbing effects. For this reason, willow twigs may have been favored not only for their structure, but for their therapeutic value, especially for those suffering from gum tenderness or early-stage infections. A peasant with a sore tooth or inflamed gums might find mild relief in the regular use of willow chewing sticks, even without fully knowing why. The bark's bitterness may have even discouraged the overgrowth of certain oral bacteria, contributing to a cleaner mouth over time. Willow's flexibility and relative softness also made it a safe choice, especially for children or the elderly, who might have weaker teeth or more sensitive gums. Ash, while harder than hazel or willow, had its own advantages. It was particularly durable, making it a longer-lasting option for those who wanted a sturdier cleaning stick. Ash trees were common across the European landscape and often associated with strength and protection in folk traditions. Twigs from young ash shoots were often straight and dense, with tight grain patterns that resisted splintering. Though the wood was more rigid, it could be gently chewed to create a frayed end, and the resulting brush could be used for rubbing the teeth, much like a modern miswak stick used in Islamic cultures. Its strength made it especially useful for those seeking a more vigorous cleaning tool, ideal for scraping away visible build-up or for use after eating particularly tough or fibrous meals. The downside was that the hardness could cause wear if used too aggressively. But for peasants with already worn enamel, the priority was often function over preservation. These chewing sticks weren't limited to a single purpose. A peasant might keep one tucked behind the ear or wedged into a sash, pulling it out after meals or in moments of idleness. Chewing could be rhythmic, almost meditative, a way to stimulate saliva, settle the stomach, or pass the time. In some cases, the practice may have been as much about oral comfort as hygiene. Much like the modern habit of chewing gum or toothpicks, these sticks offered both psychological satisfaction and mechanical benefit. The ends could be reshaped with a knife or fingernail, and new sticks were easily gathered as needed. They were biodegradable, renewable, and abundant, making them an ideal hygiene tool in a world without consumer goods. While little direct mention is made in medieval medical treatises about chewing sticks specifically, there is a broader acknowledgement of wood-based tools for cleaning the teeth. Monastic herbals and medical texts often mention tooth scrapers made from wood or bone, and in some regions aristocrats had access to carved ivory or metal toothpicks. But for the vast majority, especially peasants, sticks from nearby shrubs or trees offered a simpler, more immediate alternative. The practice would have been passed down orally, not written in books. Parents taught children, and older villagers modelled behaviours that were copied and repeated across generations. Some evidence for the use of these tools survives in archaeological finds, though it is rare. Wooden artefacts degrade easily, especially in acidic soils, but in waterlogged or anaerobic conditions like peat bogs or weltoms, researchers have occasionally recovered frayed twigs bearing signs of human tooth wear and cutting. These are almost always small handheld pieces, whittled at one end and chewed at the other. Their similarity to known chewing sticks from other cultures suggests that this was a widespread, if undocumented, practice in medieval Europe. In some cases, analysis of dental calculus, hardened plaque on skeletons, has revealed micro-scratches or striations consistent with frequent abrasive cleaning, supporting the idea that teeth were regularly rubbed with fibrous tools. Herbal knowledge likely complemented the use of these sticks. Peasants might rub mint leaves or sage against their teeth, either by themselves or wrapped around the end of a stick. Doing so added a layer of scent and antibacterial properties, even if users didn't understand the exact cause of the fresher feeling. Charcoal or ash might be dabbed onto the stick for extra grip. A willow twig with a pinch of crushed mint would not only clean the teeth but also leave the mouth feeling refreshed in a time before manufactured flavourings. These additions show a degree of intentionality. Peasants were not ignorant or passive about their hygiene. They adapted to their environment using knowledge passed down over centuries. What seems primitive today was, in many ways, a practical and efficient solution to the challenges of dental care in a low-resource world. It's important to remember that the use of chewing sticks wasn't unique to medieval Europe. Across the world, from the Middle East to East Africa to Asia, variations of this tool have been used for thousands of years. The miswak stick, for example, has been used in Islamic culture since the 7th century and remains popular today. The practice of using fibrous twigs to clean the teeth is so widespread and time-tested that modern dentists have begun re-examining it for its effectiveness. Scientific studies have shown that certain types of wood, including Salvadora persica, miswak, have natural antibacterial properties, and the physical action of brushing with these twigs can be as effective as a modern toothbrush in reducing plaque and gingivitis when used properly. In this broader context, the medieval use of hazelwood, willow and ash fits neatly into a global human strategy, using local plant-based tools to manage oral hygiene. The exact methods may have varied by region, but the underlying principle remained the same. The mouth is vulnerable, and even in the absence of modern science, people devise ways to care for it. Whether driven by discomfort, cultural habit, or simple pragmatism, medieval peasants found ways to keep their teeth clean, using what the land provided. The simplicity of the chewing stick, its availability, its ease of use, and its effectiveness helps explain why it endured for so long. It required no specialised craftsmanship, no purchase, and no external approval. It was a tool of the commons, as practical as a wooden spoon or a woven basket. Its role in oral hygiene was likely so embedded in daily routine that it went largely unremarked, even as it shaped the dental health of generations. Today, as modern dental care continues to evolve, It's worth acknowledging that many of its foundational principles, abrasion, antimicrobial action, and gum stimulation, were already being practiced by people who never heard the word bacteria. In their use of willow, hazelwood, and ash, medieval peasants were not simply surviving. They were innovating with the materials at hand, preserving their health, one chew at a time. In the medieval countryside, where specialized tools were rare and mass-produced goods virtually non-existent, people learned to modify the materials around them into everyday implements. Among the more clever and practical solutions to the problem of oral hygiene was the practice of chewing one end of a small twig until it softened and frayed into a makeshift brush. This rudimentary tool, used widely across medieval Europe by peasants and villagers, may not have looked impressive, but it served a vital function keeping teeth and gums relatively clean in a world without toothbrushes or dental floss. The process was simple, intuitive, and remarkably effective. A person would select a suitable twig, typically from a tree known for its softness and flexibility, such as hazel, willow, or ash. These species were popular not just for their abundance, but for their structure. Their bark was relatively thin and easy to strip, and their inner wood fibers broke down gradually under pressure, producing soft filaments instead of splinters. After choosing a twig, the user would chew one end slowly and deliberately. At first, the twig resisted, remaining firm and compact, but with repeated biting, grinding, and pressure from the molars, the fibers began to separate. As the outer bark wore away and the inner wood softened, the twig transformed into something akin to a fibrous brush. The user would continue chewing until the end resembled a bundle of bristles, slightly flattened and pliable, much like the head of a modern toothbrush, albeit more irregular. Once the chewing end reached this softened state, it could be used as a cleaning tool. The user would hold the twig like a stylus and apply the frayed end directly to the surfaces of the teeth. With a rubbing motion, they would work across the front and sides of each tooth, paying attention to areas where food particles might have lodged. This brushing action, while not guided by modern dental science, was grounded in practical observation. Food residue that was not cleared would cause discomfort, odours, or visible staining, and the twig could remove much of this build-up. The fibrous tips were flexible enough to move between teeth and along the gum line, lifting debris without the need for sharp implements. Over time, the tip of the twig would wear down or become too soggy to be useful. At that point, the user could simply cut or bite off the used portion and chew a new segment, repeating the process. The tool was therefore self-renewing, biodegradable, and personalised. In contrast to modern hygiene routines that rely on external products, plastic or commercial branding, this method was entirely self-sufficient. It relied only on knowledge passed from person to person and the accessibility of nearby trees. The widespread nature of this practice is evidenced by ethnographic parallels in other parts of the world. In various African, Middle Eastern and South Asian cultures, the use of chewing sticks, often from medicinal or aromatic trees, has been practiced for centuries and continues to this day. Though medieval Europeans may not have used the same trees, the technique of fraying one end through mastication is nearly identical. Such convergence across regions suggests that this method evolved not from cultural exchange, but from practical necessity. The human mouth, regardless of time or geography, faces the same basic problems: leftover food, bacterial growth, and the need to manage oral health. In the absence of soap or specialized brushes, frayed twigs provided a tactile, mechanical solution that anyone could master. The experience of chewing these sticks was not always purely hygienic. It also provided sensory feedback. The act of gnawing a twig could soothe the mouth, help manage stress, or occupy the hands and mind during idle periods. In some cases, a peasant might chew the twig while working in the field, talking with others, or sitting around the hearth. This casual use blurred the line between hygiene and habit. Over time, the chewing stick became a familiar part of daily life, as common as a belt knife or a wooden spoon. Cultural attitudes likely reinforced the practice. Cleanliness, even in its rudimentary form, was associated with moral and spiritual order. While most peasants could not afford elaborate rituals or cosmetics, tending to one's mouth with a simple stick may have been seen as part of personal discipline. In religious settings, cleanliness was often metaphorically linked to virtue. Though priests and monks had access to more refined implements, such as toothpicks carved from bone or metal, the principle remained the same. A clean mouth reflected a disciplined body and spirit. Thus, even the humble frayed twig may have held cultural significance beyond its practical use. There is some archaeological evidence to support this practice, though it remains limited by the perishable nature of wood. In exceptional preservation environments, such as bogs, wells, or sealed middens, fragments of chewed wood have been recovered that show wear consistent with prolonged oral use. These pieces, often small and smooth at one end, resemble modern miswak sticks or the historical tooth twigs recorded in later periods. Additionally, analysis of dental calculus, hardened plaque on medieval skeletons, sometimes reveals striations or patterns that suggest regular brushing with a fibrous material. These marks differ from those caused by food alone and may point to consistent mechanical cleaning over time. Historical records from the medieval period rarely mention chewing sticks directly, especially in peasant contexts, but that is not surprising. Much of daily life was transmitted orally rather than recorded, and hygiene practices, particularly among the poor, were rarely deemed worthy of chronicling by literate elites. Still, occasional references exist. Monastic texts sometimes mention tooth-cleansing woods or scraping twigs, and herbal guides compiled by learned men occasionally describe the beneficial properties of certain trees when used in the mouth. These mentions are sparse, but they hint at a broader, unspoken tradition of natural oral care among the rural population. Beyond individual twigs, the practice sometimes intersected with herbal knowledge. Some people rubbed the frayed end of the stick in ground herbs, salt, or even charcoal to enhance the cleaning effect. The bristles would hold a small amount of the substance, which could then be scrubbed against the teeth. In this way, the twig became both brush and applicator, a dual-function tool created entirely from local resources. Mint leaves, sage, thyme, and even garlic were sometimes chewed or rubbed on the gums, taking advantage of their strong flavours and potential antibacterial properties. Though the exact effect varied, the combination of friction, moisture, and herbal compounds provided a relatively effective cleaning system by medieval standards. For children, the use of frayed twigs may have doubled as teething relief. Youngsters could gnaw on sticks to soothe sore gums while inadvertently learning a lifelong habit. In a world without dental schools or fluoride treatments, oral health depended heavily on such early conditioning. Chewing sticks were an entry point into hygiene that required no literacy, wealth, or formal instruction, only a tree and the desire for a cleaner mouth. In the broader context of medieval life, the chewing stick represents an often overlooked example of resourcefulness. Peasants lived close to the land and drew their solutions from what they could see, touch, and modify. The frayed twig may not have been a glamorous tool, but it was effective, sustainable, and widely used. While today's oral care aisle is lined with electric toothbrushes, enamel-safe pastes, and high-tech flossing systems, the core principle remains the same. Physical abrasion helps remove build-up, and routine care preserves the health of the mouth. Medieval peasants achieved this not with synthetics but with wood fibres, patience, and a bit of jaw work. Though centuries have passed, the fundamental act of chewing one end of a twig to create a brush-like tool stands as a reminder that human ingenuity doesn't always require complexity. Sometimes the simplest answers come from nature, and the best toothbrush might just be the one you grow in your backyard. Oral hygiene relied less on tools and more on the natural properties of herbs and plants that were readily available to the average peasant. Among the most common methods of tooth cleaning was the practice of rubbing powdered herbs, especially sage and mint, directly onto the teeth and gums. Though lacking the germ theory of modern science, medieval people understood that certain herbs left the mouth feeling cleaner and the breath smelling fresher. This knowledge, passed down through generations, became an everyday part of rural hygiene, requiring nothing more than a garden, a mortar and pestle, and a moment of mindfulness. Sage, in particular, was a favoured choice for oral health. Known in Latin as Salvia officinalis, it was valued not only for its culinary and medicinal uses, but for its ability to cleanse the mouth. Peasants would dry the leaves, crush them into a fine powder, and then apply this directly to the teeth, using a finger or the frayed end of a chewing stick. The mild abrasiveness of the powdered sage helped to scrub away food residue and plaque buildup. Additionally, sage has natural antibacterial properties, which, though unknown in a scientific sense at the time, contributed to better breath and a reduction in gum inflammation. Monastic herbals and early medical texts often recommended sage for strengthening the gums and cleansing foul humours of the mouth. Mint, too, was a popular option. More aromatic than sage, it was often used to freshen breath, especially after eating garlic, onions or preserved meats. Like sage, mint could be dried and powdered, though it was also sometimes chewed fresh. A small pinch of mint powder rubbed on the teeth before or after a meal provided a cooling sensation that peasants likely associated with cleanliness. Mint's essential oils had mild antimicrobial effects, making it more than just a breath freshener. Even without a modern understanding of bacteria, people could sense that using mint left their mouths cleaner and less sour. These powdered herbs were applied with rudimentary tools, the finger, a linen cloth, or a frayed twig used like a brush. In some cases, they were mixed with salt or charcoal to create a gritty paste. While harsh by today's standards, these mixtures helped scour the teeth and neutralise odours. The act of rubbing them onto the enamel became part of the natural rhythm of peasant life, performed before Sunday Mass, after meals, or in moments of reflection. Despite the lack of dentistry, this herbal approach to tooth care shows how deeply people relied on plants, not just for sustenance, but for hygiene. Mint and sage grew in gardens and along paths, humble in appearance but powerful in use. In a world without toothpaste, these herbs helped preserve not just oral health but dignity. At this time, salt wasn't just a preservative or flavouring, it was also a cleaning agent, including for the teeth. Though its primary value was economic and culinary, salt occasionally found its way into hygiene routines, especially among those who sought something gritty and effective to scour their teeth. Coarse salt, when used sparingly and carefully, acted as a mild abrasive. It could remove visible build-up on teeth and freshen breath, providing a rudimentary but practical method of oral care in a world without toothpaste. Peasants with access to salt, whether through trade, coastal proximity, or household preservation stores, might crush it into finer crystals using a mortar and pestle, or simply pinch it directly from a sack. The grains could then be applied to the teeth with a finger, or mixed with water or powdered herbs such as sage or mint. Some would dab it onto the end of a chewed twig or cloth and rub it along the surfaces of the teeth. The rough texture helped dislodge food particles and soften hardened residues, much like a gritty polishing agent. The sensation was strong, sometimes unpleasant, but the results were noticeable. Cleaner feeling teeth and fresher breath. Salt also had natural antibacterial properties. Without an understanding of microbes, medieval people nevertheless recognized that salted items lasted longer and that salt had a purifying quality. It was used to clean wounds, cure meat, and draw moisture from vegetables for preservation. When applied to the mouth, it helped reduce odour, stave off mild infections, and soothe swollen gums. Folk remedies often called for rinsing the mouth with warm salt water after a toothache, or applying a salt and herb poultice to the jaw to relieve pain. While these treatments varied in effectiveness, they reflected an intuitive grasp of salt's cleansing role. However, salt was not always available in abundance. Inland peasants might only use it occasionally due to its high cost or limited supply. Coastal communities, or those living near salt springs, had more frequent access and may have used it more regularly in hygiene. In wealthier households or monasteries, salt might have been paired with more elaborate herbal blends or stored in small wooden containers, specifically for grooming purposes. Because salt was coarse and potentially damaging to enamel when overused, its application was likely occasional rather than daily. Most people would not have had enough of it to waste, and the discomfort of rubbing sharp grains on sensitive gums meant it was used when needed, not as a regular ritual. Still, its role as an early cleaning agent is significant. In the absence of baking soda or fluoride, salt provided friction and preservation in one simple mineral. Salt's utility extended from the pantry to the hearth to the curing room and finally to the mouth, showcasing again how medieval people turned to the materials around them for every necessity, including keeping their smiles relatively clean. Medieval people often relied on the most basic items available to them, one of which was cloth. Clean rags or scraps of linen were sometimes used to rub the teeth and gums as part of daily or occasional oral care. This method required no special materials beyond what was already in the home, making it an accessible and practical practice, particularly among peasants. Linen was the most commonly available fabric among medieval families, especially in rural areas. Old shifts, worn-out tunics, or scraps from sewing could be cut into strips and repurposed for personal hygiene. A person might wrap a strip around a finger and use it to wipe the teeth, applying gentle pressure to remove food residue and stimulate the gums. The texture of the cloth allowed for friction, enough to clean the surfaces without causing injury. For individuals with sore gums or loose teeth, cloth was less abrasive than salt or charcoal and therefore preferable. This method was especially common among women who were typically in charge of domestic duties, including healthcare and cleanliness. Mothers might wipe their children's mouths with cloth after meals, not just to remove food from lips and cheeks, but also as a rudimentary tooth cleaning habit. Over time, such practices could become part of the household routine, even if informal and unspoken. Older family members, particularly those with few remaining teeth, may have used cloth simply because it was gentle and familiar. Cloth was sometimes used alone, but it also served as a vehicle for other substances. A pinch of powdered mint, sage, or salt might be sprinkled onto the cloth before rubbing it on the teeth. This added both flavour and abrasive action. In some cases, vinegar or wine was used to moisten the cloth, providing mild antiseptic qualities. A damp linen rag could be passed across the teeth and gums to clear residue, kill odour, and leave the mouth feeling fresher. While not as effective as modern brushing, this method did offer some dental benefits. The mechanical act of rubbing helped remove soft debris, discourage plaque buildup, and increase blood flow to the gums. These effects, while modest, contributed to overall oral health and show how medieval people used what they had on hand to meet basic hygiene needs. Cloth rags were reused until they wore out completely. A rag used for tooth cleaning might later become a polishing cloth for cookware or kindling for a hearth. Nothing was wasted. That such humble scraps played a role in personal care illustrates the resourcefulness of medieval households. Even without understanding modern dentistry, people recognised the importance of keeping their mouths relatively clean, and did so with whatever was close, washable, and soft enough to serve the task. Because daily meals often consisted of strong-smelling ingredients like onions, garlic, preserved meats, and fermented foods, the concern over bad breath was very real. Though the term halitosis didn't exist, the social discomfort associated with foul-smelling breath was universally understood. Whether in a church pew, around the communal table, or in conversation at the local fair, keeping one's mouth relatively fresh was a matter of basic dignity and social courtesy. Without access to toothpaste or mouthwash, medieval people turned to the landscape around them, and they found an effective and affordable solution in herbs. Among the most common mouth fresheners were parsley, mint, and sage. These herbs were widely cultivated in gardens, grown in monastery plots, or found in the wild. Known for their aromatic properties and palatable flavours, they were used not only in cooking and medicine, but also as natural breath fresheners. After meals, it was common for people to chew on a small handful of fresh leaves, not necessarily as a formal ritual, but as a practical habit. These herbs didn't just mask odour, they provided a genuine, if temporary, improvement to the freshness of one's breath. Parsley was particularly valued. Its clean, grassy taste made it ideal for cutting through the pungency of preserved meats or dairy-based dishes. It was easy to grow, hardy even in cool climates, and often used as both garnish and remedy. Herbal texts of the time praised parsley for its purging and cleansing properties, particularly for the stomach and breath. When chewed raw, its fibrous structure also helped sweep away food particles lodged in the teeth. Though lacking in antiseptic power, parsley's chlorophyll content likely had a mild deodorizing effect, making it a reliable post-meal choice. Mint, especially spearmint and wild varieties, was another popular option. Its cooling, tingling flavour made it a favourite among those looking for a stronger sense of cleanliness. Mint grew abundantly along stream beds and in home gardens, spreading easily and often being considered semi-invasive. Its essential oils, while not fully understood at the time, provided a more intense burst of freshness. Chewing mint leaves after meals not only made the breath smell better, it also left a pleasant aftertaste that helped balance the strong flavours of common medieval fare. In religious settings where silence and cleanliness were valued, monks and nuns sometimes grew mint specifically for hygiene purposes. In some abbey gardens, mint was listed among the physic herbs, plants used for maintaining health. Its use for bad breath is implied in texts describing it as sweetening to the mouth and cleansing of foul humours. In an era when communal meals were eaten shoulder to shoulder and prayers were often spoken aloud, a clean-smelling mouth served more than aesthetic purposes. It was an act of consideration for others. Sage, meanwhile, straddled the line between hygiene and medicine. Known in Latin as Salvia officinalis, it was one of the most respected herbs in the medieval world. Its uses spanned from digestion aid to sore throat treatment, and it was frequently recommended for oral health. The astringent, slightly bitter flavour of sage might not have been as pleasant as mint or parsley, but it had a staying power that made it effective for clearing lingering tastes and neutralising mouth odours. People chewed fresh sage leaves, rubbed them on their teeth, or brewed them into rinses and gargles. In some households, sage was grown specifically near kitchen doors for easy access after meals. These herbal habits didn't originate solely from peasants or monks. They were common across social classes. Nobles might chew the same herbs after feasts, especially when wine and meat were abundant. In the absence of silver dental tools or refined hygiene items, herbs were the great equaliser. They grew in gardens, along roadsides, or were sold in small bundles at local markets. Even children learned early that a handful of mint or parsley could earn them a kiss from grandma, or spare them scolding for their garlic mouth. There's some evidence that people mixed herbs for stronger results. A leaf of mint with a sprig of sage, for example, created a cooling and cleansing blend. Chewing wasn't the only method. Some ground the herbs into powders and rubbed them directly onto the tongue or gums. Herbalists might advise steeping leaves in vinegar or wine to create a rinse, letting the solution rest in the mouth after meals. While not all of these methods were effective by modern standards, they reflected a growing understanding that certain plants had purifying effects. Bad breath wasn't just seen as unpleasant, it was sometimes considered a sign of imbalance or illness. In medieval humoral theory, foul breath was associated with an excess of bad humours rising from the stomach or throat. As such, herbal fresheners were not only cosmetic, they were used with the belief that they restored balance. A clean mouth indicated a healthier body, and a healthy body was closer to spiritual cleanliness. This may explain why monasteries took special care in maintaining herb gardens and why oral cleansing was occasionally mentioned in confessional or penance rituals. These practices continued for centuries and were recorded in some of the earliest printed herbals of the Renaissance. The habits of chewing mint or rubbing sage on the gums evolved over time but remained recognisable even into the early modern period. Some traditions, like carrying sprigs of herbs to sniff in crowded markets or churches, were part of broader efforts to combat foul smells and contagious illnesses, especially during plagues. The link between scent and health, so central to medieval thinking, meant that the same herbs used to freshen the mouth were also used to ward off disease. Today, many of these habits persist in different forms. We still flavour toothpaste and chewing gum with mint, use sage in mouth rinses, and recognise parsley's deodorising effects. The medieval approach to bad breath wasn't based on modern science, but it was grounded in observation, availability, and the lived experience of communal life. In villages where space was shared and privacy rare, herbal fresheners were more than simple niceties. They were part of the social glue. Two of the most effective and widely used items for keeping breath fresh were clove and fennel seeds, both praised for their aromatic strength and lingering freshness. These were not casual flavourings but powerful breath fresheners, especially useful after meals heavy with onions, salted fish, and garlic, common in peasant and noble diets alike. Clove, the dried flower bud of the Syzygium aromaticum tree, was not native to Europe. It arrived through complex and expensive trade routes from the east, particularly from the Moluccas or the Spice Islands in modern-day Indonesia. Because of the difficulty in obtaining cloves, they were expensive and more commonly available to nobles, wealthy merchants, or monasteries that had access to trade goods. However, in households that did have them, even a single clove could go a long way. A person would take a whole clove and chew it slowly, sometimes for several minutes. The process released a powerful, slightly numbing oil that freshened the breath, dulled oral pain, and left a lingering, spicy aroma. The active compound in clove, eugenol, has natural antiseptic and analgesic properties. Though medieval people did not know this chemically, they were aware that chewing clove helped relieve toothaches, made the mouth feel cleaner, and reduced the foul smells that might otherwise linger after a heavy meal. In some monastic or apothecary records, cloves are noted specifically for their use in cases of foul breath or pain of the jaw. They were also sometimes inserted near aching teeth as a rudimentary form of pain relief. Cloves weren't used only for medicinal purposes. They were also part of social customs. Chewing one before speaking with someone important, before attending church or after a feast. In some wealthier homes, cloves might be offered alongside wine or in small pouches meant to be carried in the sleeve or belt pouch. The scent alone was considered pleasant enough to improve one's presence, and in tight social quarters, that could make a difference. Fennel seeds, on the other hand, were far more common and accessible to the general population. Fennel grew widely across Europe, often in kitchen gardens, monastery plots, or as a wild plant along roadsides and in open meadows. The seeds were easily harvested and dried, and their sweet, slightly anise-like flavour made them a favourite for chewing after meals. In fact, fennel's use as a breath freshener likely predates the Middle Ages, with records of its use going back to ancient Greece and Rome. In peasant households, fennel seeds were part of everyday cooking and medicine. After eating, especially after meals involving fish or strong cheeses, people might chew a pinch of seeds to cleanse the mouth. The seeds could be stored in small ceramic containers, cloth bundles, or simply pinched from the drying rack. Because of their mild sweetness and crunch, they were also sometimes given to children as a treat after meals. Fennel's essential oils, especially anethole, had mild antibacterial and deodorizing effects, making it genuinely useful for oral hygiene. The widespread use of fennel seeds among the poor made it a sort of peasant's answer to the nobleman's clove. Both served the same function but were shaped by availability and class. In monastic herbals, fennel was praised for its ability to sweeten the breath and lighten the digestion, and it was not uncommon for monks or laypeople to chew fennel as part of routine health practice. Fennel was also associated with purification, both physical and spiritual, which may explain its inclusion in religious fasts and festivals. In towns and villages, chewing seeds was sometimes a communal practice. People might share seeds at the end of a meal, much as modern people might offer gum or mints. In marketplaces or gatherings where close quarters were the norm, having fresh breath was more than a vanity, it was a courtesy. Fennel seeds were inexpensive, easy to carry, and even sold in bundles by herb women or travelling peddlers. Because they lasted a long time when dried, fennel seeds were a reliable year-round solution, even in the depths of winter. Clove and fennel weren't always used separately. In some homes they were ground together or soaked in wine to create an herbal rinse or tonic. A few medical texts suggest recipes for mouth waters made by steeping both in vinegar or rose water, then rinsing the mouth after meals. While such remedies were more common in literate or wealthy households, the basic principle, using strong-smelling seeds to fight stronger-smelling food, was universally understood. Cultural beliefs also shaped their use. Cloves were sometimes burned as incense in homes, or added to pomanders, herbal balls used for scent, carried during illness. Fennel was thought to ward off evil or disease and was occasionally hung in doorways. While not directly linked to oral hygiene, these associations reflected the broader belief that scent was tied to health, and by extension that breath was something worth managing. Ultimately, both clove and fennel were small but meaningful parts of medieval daily life. They show how people, regardless of wealth, sought solutions for social hygiene with the tools and resources available to them. Chewing a clove or fennel seed didn't just improve breath, it gave a sense of control, dignity and comfort in a world that lacked modern dentistry. These humble seeds served as bridges between meals and meetings, between survival and civility. Another way to keep breath smelling minty and fresh was by using rosemary. Its sharp, piney scent and versatile uses made it a staple in both the kitchen and the apothecary. Among its many applications, rosemary was valued for its role in hygiene, particularly in maintaining oral health and freshening breath. Rosemary was grown in monastery gardens, manor house herb beds, and even window boxes in urban homes. It was hardy and aromatic, with a reputation as a symbol of remembrance, purity, and fidelity. In medical and herbal texts of the time, such as those following the teachings of Hildegard of Bingen or the Trottian or the Trotula, rosemary was recommended for a variety of uses: to sharpen the mind, to warm the body, and to clean wounds. Among these, it was also noted for being beneficial to the mouth and teeth. People often chewed rosemary leaves directly to freshen breath. While the flavour was strong, almost medicinal, it was long-lasting and noticeably cleansing. The oils in rosemary had mild antibacterial properties, helping to reduce odour-causing bacteria in the mouth. While medieval users didn't understand microbial theory, they recognised from experience that certain herbs made the mouth feel cleaner and improved its scent, especially after meals heavy with garlic, fish, or fermented dairy. In some households, rosemary was steeped in hot water, wine, or vinegar to make a rinse. The resulting liquid was swished around the mouth after eating, similar to how a modern mouthwash might be used. This not only freshened the breath, but was also believed to balance the body's humours and soothe minor ailments of the mouth and throat. Some records suggest that a rosemary and wine rinse could be used to ease tooth pain or reduce inflammation in the gums. The herb's strong aroma also meant it could be carried easily, tucked into pouches, sleeves, or even worn in garlands. In church, at market, or during long fasts, a sprig of rosemary behind the ear or under the chin might be chewed when needed. In more formal or religious settings, rosemary was burned or crushed into potpourri for its cleansing scent, again reinforcing its association with purity, including oral freshness. Rosemary's cleansing reputation was more than just symbolic. It was one of the few herbs that crossed boundaries, culinary, medicinal and hygienic, earning it a lasting place in medieval daily life. Whether as a sprig after supper or a rinse made by the hearth, rosemary helped medieval people stay just a bit cleaner in a very unsterile world. Rosemary's cleansing role in medieval life did not stop at chewing leaves or tucking sprigs behind the ear. For those with access to simple kitchen tools and a few herbal ingredients, the next logical step in oral hygiene was to create mouth rinses, and in a time before tap water and store-bought antiseptics, these rinses were often made with wine or vinegar infusions. Wine, particularly the lower quality small wine or spiced varieties known as hippocras, was a common ingredient in home remedies. Slightly acidic, mildly alcoholic, and easily infused with herbs, it served as both solvent and antiseptic. Vinegar, made from wine, apples, or other fermented fruits, was even more potent. Though too harsh to be consumed directly in large amounts, it was often diluted or sweetened and used medicinally, prized for its cleansing effect on wounds, household surfaces, and of course the mouth. A simple rinse might begin by steeping rosemary in warmed vinegar or wine. The infusion was left to sit overnight or gently simmered by the hearth to draw out the aromatic oils. Other herbs were often added: mint for freshness, sage for astringency, and thyme for its sharp medicinal note. Once strained and cooled, the mixture could be stored in a small ceramic vessel or reused over several days. Users would take a mouthful, swish it around their teeth and gums, and spit it out, sometimes with a dramatic grimace, as these mixtures were not always pleasant. Despite the taste, people appreciated the immediate effect. The rinse left the breath scented with wine and herbs, dulled the sting of sore gums, and offered a momentary sense of cleanliness in a world filled with strong smells and limited sanitation. Monasteries often documented such preparations in their herbal manuals, and some early printed medical texts passed these recipes on to literate households. For poorer villagers without wine to spare, diluted vinegar alone might be used. Even this harsher version, when combined with mint or sage, was preferable to nothing at all. Some people even added a pinch of salt to improve the rinse's cleansing effect. It wasn't about sparkle or whiteness, it was about odour control, pain relief, and the simple feeling of a fresher mouth. These rinses remind us that medieval hygiene was more thoughtful and experimental than it's often given credit for. With no synthetic ingredients, no toothbrushes, and little scientific understanding of bacteria, people still managed to invent methods that, while rough by modern standards, addressed real problems. A rosemary and vinegar mouth rinse wasn't just a home remedy, it was part of a wider rhythm of care. Cooking, steeping, tending, and preserving what little one had to stay clean, dignified, and socially present in a crowded, noisy world. This effort to stay clean and dignified wasn't purely about comfort, it also reflected deeper cultural values. In the medieval world, physical cleanliness often carried moral weight, and nowhere was this more literal than in the matter of the mouth. Bad breath wasn't just unpleasant. In some circles, it was interpreted as a sign of spiritual decay, sinfulness, or even divine disfavour. The body, in Christian medieval thought, was a vessel for the soul, and its condition often symbolised internal virtue, or the lack of it. Just as festering wounds might be seen as a sign of corruption or divine punishment, foul breath could be viewed as evidence of gluttony, drunkenness, or sloth. To have a clean mouth wasn't just a hygienic matter, it was at times a reflection of one's discipline, modesty, and moral standing. Clerical texts and sermons sometimes reference the stench of the mouth as an echo of sinful habits. Excessive indulgence in rich food, wine, or idle talk were not only discouraged for their worldly implications, but also for the physical consequences they left behind. A man who reeked of garlic and wine might be labelled not just unclean, but unrestrained. A woman who whispered gossip and rarely rinsed her mouth could be called impure in both word and breath. This thinking bled into popular culture as well. In courtly romances and folk tales, heroes and ladies were often described as sweet-smelling, their breath likened to flowers or spice. Villains, drunkards, or fools, by contrast, were depicted with offensive odours and stained teeth. In such narratives, the scent of a character's mouth was shorthand for their virtues, or lack thereof. In religious life, this symbolism was even sharper. Monks and nuns who fasted regularly and avoided rich food were often said to possess a more pure presence, and this purity extended to the breath. Oral cleanliness was not always enforced by rule, but it was encouraged as part of general bodily discipline. After all, the mouth was the organ of both prayer and sin, used to speak scripture, confess sins, or spread rumour and indulgence. Its state mattered, both literally and metaphorically. It's no wonder then that herbal rinses, breath-freshening seeds and tooth rubs were treated with a level of reverence. They were not merely cosmetic. They were tools for managing social perception, moral presentation, and one's standing in both the earthly and spiritual communities. A clean mouth could make a good impression, but more importantly, it could make a person feel worthy of speaking before others, be it a neighbour, a priest, or God himself. If a clean mouth was tied to virtue, then the presence of dental pain brought its own set of fears and cultural interpretations. Toothaches were deeply dreaded in the medieval world, not just for the physical agony they caused, but for the helplessness they revealed. A sharp, persistent pain in the jaw could disrupt work, sleep, speech, and even prayer. Remedies were often limited, painful, or completely ineffective. But curiously, for all this fear, full-blown tooth rot, the black, crumbling, abscess-riddled mouths we might associate with the Middle Ages, was surprisingly uncommon, especially among peasants. The truth is that most medieval people didn't suffer from rampant cavities the way we might assume. Archaeological studies of skeletal remains across medieval Europe consistently show relatively low rates of severe dental decay, particularly in the earlier parts of the Middle Ages. When cavities were present, they were often shallow, confined to the biting surfaces of molars, rather than the deep interproximal root decay seen in modern times. Why? The answer is closely tied to their diet. As discussed earlier, the medieval diet, particularly for peasants, was low in refined sugars. Bread, grains, legumes, root vegetables, and preserved meats made up the bulk of daily calories. These foods, while not entirely harmless to teeth, didn't promote the rapid, acid-producing bacterial growth that today's sugar-laden diets do. Sweets, when they appeared, were infrequent and expensive. Honey on holy days, spiced cakes during festivals, fruit in season. A typical peasant might go weeks without consuming anything that would fuel the kinds of bacteria most responsible for tooth decay today. In addition to the lack of sugar, the physical nature of medieval food actually helped protect the teeth. Dense, chewy bread made from coarse flour often required significant effort to eat and created mechanical friction on the teeth. Raw vegetables, nuts, seeds, and even meat with bone encouraged prolonged chewing, an act that helped clean tooth surfaces naturally. While these tough foods could cause wear over time, they also reduced the chance for food particles to linger between the teeth and rot. Some wear and tear was expected. But decay? Less so. This doesn't mean that everyone had perfect teeth. Enamel wear, exposure of the dentin, and age-related erosion were common, especially in older adults. Some teeth were worn nearly flat from a lifetime of chewing coarse, gritty bread, often contaminated with bits of stone or bran from primitive milling processes. But these were signs of use, not decay. Many older skeletons reveal heavily worn teeth, but teeth are intact and without cavities. Cavities, when they did occur, tended to be superficial. Without sticky candies, sweet drinks, or frequent snacking, bacterial colonies had fewer opportunities to produce the deep enamel breakdown. And without refined carbohydrates constantly coating the teeth, the pH of the mouth likely remained more balanced throughout the day. In fact, even children's remains show fewer cavities than modern kids, especially in rural contexts. It's also important to note that what we think of as rotting teeth is often a product of more recent centuries, particularly post-industrial revolution diets. By the 17th and 18th centuries, sugar imports from colonies had become far more accessible, especially to the middle and upper classes. That's when we start to see dramatic increases in dental decay and tooth loss in historical records. But back in the medieval period, especially before sugar became common, decay was neither as visible nor as widespread as modern media or pop culture often suggest. Medical texts from the time do mention toothaches, but their focus is largely on pain management, not decay removal. Poultices, herbal pastes, and even cautery, burning, were recommended for dental pain, but there's little evidence of widespread tooth extraction for rot unless the pain became unbearable. In some regions, tooth drawers or travelling practitioners might remove a troublesome tooth, but this was a last resort and not a reflection of rampant mouth disease. It was the exception, not the norm. Moreover, there was a cultural expectation that some pain simply came with age or poor fortune. A toothache might be blamed on toothworms, a misunderstood theory of the time, or on imbalance in the bodily humours. But rot and blackened stumps, particularly in youth, were not the common visual we assumed they were. Those who did suffer severe dental issues might also have had underlying health conditions or diets far different from the average peasant, such as monks who consumed more dried fruits and wine, or nobles with access to imported sweets. Ultimately, medieval teeth paint a picture of resilience rather than ruin. In a world without fluoride, toothbrushes or dentists, the simple structure of the diet and the mechanical nature of eating help preserve dental health better than we might expect. Painful teeth did exist. Infections, abscesses, and lost molars were part of the reality. But widespread black rot? That was not the norm. To imagine the medieval smile as a horror show of decay and disease is to misunderstand both history and biology. The daily hardships of survival demanded functional teeth, and for many, they held up surprisingly well under pressure. Whether through low-sugar diets, abrasive food textures, or practical oral habits like rinsing with vinegar and chewing herbs, medieval people often kept their teeth long into adulthood, and in better shape than we might think. Though many medieval people kept most of their teeth into adulthood, tooth loss still happened, but not always because of decay. More often, it was the result of trauma, long-term wear, or the gradual weakening of the body with age. In fact, for peasants especially, the forces that loosened or knocked out teeth were often tied more closely to lifestyle and environment than to oral hygiene, or the lack thereof. Life in the medieval countryside was physically demanding. Fields were ploughed, hay was stacked, carts were lifted, and stones were hauled, often by hand and often without tools offering modern safety protections. Blows to the face, falls from livestock, or simple accidents involving tools or stones could easily result in broken or dislodged teeth. There are skeletal remains showing cracked molars or chipped incisors, consistent with trauma rather than rot. Soldiers and working men in particular had higher instances of tooth loss in patterns that suggest physical injury rather than disease. In addition to accidents, age-related bone loss was a common cause of tooth loosening. As people grew older, especially those who had weathered a lifetime of hard work and poor nutrition, the supporting structures around the teeth could weaken. Gums receded, jawbones thinned, and teeth that had once been firm began to wiggle. Eventually, they fell out or were removed when the pain became too much to bear. This type of tooth loss was gradual, often affecting one or two teeth at a time, and could leave gaps that were simply accepted as part of aging. Wear and erosion also played a part. As mentioned earlier, the bread eaten by medieval peasants was often coarse, full of grit from stone-ground flour. Over decades, this could grind the teeth down to flat surfaces, sometimes right to the gum line. The enamel might be worn away entirely, exposing the dentin beneath and making teeth more vulnerable to breakage. But again, this was not necessarily decay, it was mechanical wear, the long-term consequence of chewing tough food every day of one's life. Importantly, tooth loss did not carry the same aesthetic stigma in the Middle Ages as it does today. A missing tooth was not considered a personal failing or something to hide. It was seen as part of the body's aging process, no different from a crooked finger or a wrinkled brow. Even among the nobility, dental repair was rare, and false teeth were all but unheard of. People lived with the gaps, the shifts in bite, and the slurred words that sometimes came with them. So while medieval people did experience tooth loss, the causes were grounded more in the realities of their physical world, farm injuries, stone bread, and the march of time, than in widespread decay. Their teeth bore the marks of survival, not neglect. Even though most tooth loss in the medieval world came from injury or age, dental infections and abscesses were still a grim reality, just not as sudden or widespread as modern portrayals suggest. When they did occur, they were often slow to develop, beginning quietly and worsening over time, sometimes going unnoticed until the pain became unbearable. For many medieval people, it wasn't rot that cost them their teeth, but the festering consequences of untreated infection. Abscesses typically formed when a crack in a tooth or the exposure of the dentin allowed bacteria to enter the inner pulp. From there, without any means of cleaning deep inside the tooth or treating the infection with antibiotics, which did not yet exist, bacteria could spread slowly, building pressure as pus collected near the root. The process was gradual, often taking weeks or even months before the infection broke through the gum or caused noticeable swelling of the jaw. The pain of an abscessed tooth was often described in medieval texts with vivid language, gnawing, hammering, or stabbing sensations that could keep a person from sleeping or speaking. Some turned to herbal remedies, poultices made from warm bread and milk, infusions of sage or plantain leaves, or rinses with vinegar, salt, or wine. These treatments might offer some comfort, but they rarely addressed the root cause. In rural areas, people sometimes believed the pain came from toothworms, a holdover from ancient medical theory. Remedies aimed at driving out these imaginary worms ranged from the symbolic burning herbs near the mouth to the extreme drilling or cauterizing the tooth. In the absence of true surgical dentistry, many abscesses eventually burst on their own, draining pus into the mouth or through the skin of the jaw. This could temporarily relieve the pain, but did little to remove the infection. In severe cases, especially in individuals with weakened immune systems, the infection could spread beyond the tooth and become life-threatening. Cases of sepsis originating from dental abscesses are known to have occurred, although they were likely underreported and often misunderstood. Interestingly, archaeological evidence shows that abscesses were more common in older adults whose worn teeth and receding gums made infection more likely. Remains sometimes show clear signs of chronic infection, holes in the jawbone where pus drained, or bone growths where the body tried to wall off the problem. But these cases were still the exception, not the rule. The presence of abscesses in medieval life reminds us that while serious dental issues did exist, they developed slowly and were often endured for long periods before becoming critical. For many, the body coped as best it could, and people continued to work, speak, and eat through pain that would send modern patients rushing to a dentist. In the end, as with so much of medieval health, the reality was not one of constant suffering, but of pragmatic endurance. A quiet, grinding battle between body and time. While infection and injury remained the main culprits behind severe dental issues, many other causes of modern tooth damage were simply absent from the medieval world, especially acidic erosion. In fact, one of the quiet advantages medieval mouths enjoyed was the lack of common substances that wear down enamel today, things like citrus fruits, carbonated drinks, and processed fruit juices. These were either extremely rare or completely unknown to the average medieval peasant, meaning the teeth weren't exposed to constant chemical attacks. Enamel, the hardest substance in the human body, is still vulnerable to repeated exposure to acid. In modern diets, this erosion is often caused by popular beverages, sodas, energy drinks, citrus juices, and even flavoured sparkling waters. The acid softens the enamel, which then becomes more susceptible to abrasion from brushing or chewing. Over time, this weakens the teeth and opens the door to cavities and sensitivity. But in the Middle Ages, none of these acidic drinks existed. Even lemons and oranges, now staples of kitchen tables and supermarket shelves, were rare luxury imports, found only in warmer Mediterranean climates and even mostly within noble households. For the average medieval villager, citrus fruits were not part of daily meals. Vinegar, which was acidic, did exist and was used in cooking, preserving, and even in some oral rinses. But it wasn't consumed in high volumes or sipped throughout the day as beverages are now. Instead, water, ale, or thin gruel-like beverages were the standard liquids, and while these weren't always clean by today's standards, they weren't acidic enough to erode teeth. In addition, meals were consumed at set times without not grazed on continuously throughout the day, giving the mouth time to naturally neutralize its pH between eating sessions. Saliva played its quiet but crucial role, washing away food particles and helping to reharden enamel, softened during meals. Without frequent acidic snacks or sugary sodas to disrupt this cycle, the natural repair processes in the mouth had more time to work. This lack of acid exposure also meant that people brushed, or rather rubbed, their teeth without softening the enamel first, which likely reduced the risk of erosion through mechanical force. Today, dentists warn against brushing immediately after drinking citrus or soda for this reason. But for medieval people, such timing wasn't an issue. They weren't sipping on orange juice between meals or crunching through vinegar-drenched snacks. In a way, this absence of modern dietary culprits may have acted as an invisible protector. Their enamel might have been worn by grit and years of use, but it wasn't being chemically dissolved on a daily basis. In the battle between enamel and the outside world, medieval diets gave teeth a fighting chance, not by deliberate design, but simply through the limits of the time. Despite the advantages of a low-acid, low-sugar diet, not all medieval dental knowledge was accurate. When pain struck, whether from worn enamel, infection, or an unseen abscess, medieval people reached for the best explanations available to them. And more often than not, the culprit they named wasn't bacteria, acid, or inflammation. It was worms. Yes, toothworms were a widely believed and persistent myth across much of the medieval world. Long before microscopes revealed the bacterial causes of decay and infection, people believed that small living creatures had burrowed into their teeth and were causing the pain from within. The image was disturbingly vivid, squirming little worms gnawing away at the tooth's root, invisible to the eye but undeniably real in the imagination. The origins of this myth go back centuries, possibly even to ancient Sumeria and Egypt, but it flourished in the Middle Ages. With no understanding of germs, people interpreted pain as something crawling or boring its way through the body. And since decay often created dark holes or tunnels in the tooth, the worm theory seemed to fit. The throbbing pressure of an abscess, the sharp jab of exposed dentin, or the dull ache of infected pulp all felt like something living inside the tooth. People describe these sensations in terms that reinforce the worm idea: burrowing, biting, crawling. Healers and folk practitioners developed treatments designed specifically to kill or extract these imaginary worms. Hot poultices were placed on the face to drive them out, foul-smelling herbs were burned near the cheek or nostril to suffocate them, and vinegar rinses were used to flush them loose. In some regions, clove oil or roasted onions were packed into the mouth, not to dull the pain as we might now recognise, but to poison the worm. There are even recorded attempts to trick the worms. Some texts describe placing a dead tooth in a container with vinegar or smoke and watching as tiny worms seemingly emerged, likely due to fly larvae, but interpreted as proof of the theory. These demonstrations helped the belief persist for centuries, even as other medical knowledge evolved. Interestingly, the toothworm myth also offered emotional comfort. It externalized the pain. It wasn't the person's fault, nor was it divine punishment, but the work of an invader. Like lice or intestinal worms, toothworms could be imagined and named, fought. The pain had a cause, and when pain has a face, even a mythical one, it becomes easier to bear. So while their understanding of oral health was rooted in myth, medieval people did the best they could with the knowledge available, and though there were no actual worms behind their suffering, the treatments they developed, herbal rinses, soothing pastes, and even tooth extractions, often worked anyway. Medieval people misunderstood many causes of tooth pain, such as their firm belief in the dreaded toothworm. They also held on to certain folk remedies that, curiously enough, held real cleaning power. These were not glamorous solutions. There were no scented gels or minty pastes. But deep in the villages and farmsteads of medieval Europe, peasants used what they had: clay, ash, and grit, the very earth and fire of their surroundings. This wasn't dental care as we know it, but it was something, and in some cases it was surprisingly effective. Without any concept of toothpaste, peasants who cared about keeping their teeth clean, or at least reducing discomfort or smell, often reached for the simplest materials they could find. Clay, in particular, became a humble but practical tool. Clay was abundant, especially in the muddy fields of northern Europe, and it had long been used in medicinal and cleansing contexts. In some regions, clay was recognised for its ability to absorb impurities. This same property made it appealing for dental hygiene. People would gather fine, clean clay, sometimes white, sometimes grey or red depending on the soil, and let it dry out before grinding it into powder. This powder might be mixed with water into a paste, or simply rubbed directly onto the teeth using a finger or a cloth scrap. What made clay useful was its mild abrasiveness. Much like modern toothpaste contains tiny particles to scrub plaque from enamel, clay offered just enough grit to remove debris without doing much harm. It didn't foam and it wasn't sweet, but it left the teeth cleaner than before. In some places, clay was mixed with dried herbs like mint, thyme or sage to mask the earthy taste and add a bit of freshness. This created a rudimentary form of tooth powder, centuries before anything like that would be commercially produced. Ash was also used, particularly wood ash from clean-burning fires. This was not an uncommon practice in households where wood was burned daily for cooking and warmth. The ash from hardwoods, oak, beech or ash trees, contained alkaline compounds that could help break down food residue. Sometimes people would wet their fingers, dip them in ash, and rub the mixture along their teeth and gums. It tasted bitter and left a residue, but it had a cleansing effect and reduced the sourness or staleness of morning breath. In some recorded cases, burnt animal bones were crushed into fine powder and added to ash to increase the scrubbing power. This was likely an idea passed down through local healers or monks, who might have recognised that bone contained calcium and other minerals. The bone ash helped give teeth a slightly polished surface and was more palatable than regular soot or coal ash, which were avoided for obvious reasons. These practices varied widely by region and social class. In wealthier households, a more refined version of this tooth powder might include powdered myrrh, dried roses, or saltpetre, ingredients thought to have antiseptic qualities. But among peasants, clay and ash remained the go-to materials, shared through generations and taught as part of daily survival habits. Importantly, these methods didn't just appear out of nowhere. The use of earth and fire to purify the body has deep roots in both ancient European and Middle Eastern medicine. Ancient Greek and Roman physicians often recommended charcoal or ash-based tooth powders, and these ideas trickled down through medieval medical texts and monastic knowledge, where they mingled with folk traditions already in use. By the time of the High Middle Ages, these rudimentary cleansers had become part of the unspoken fabric of rural hygiene. There were no written manuals for most peasants. Instead, these habits were learned by watching a mother clean her teeth with a cloth and a smear of clay, or by hearing an older sibling complain that someone used the wrong kind of ash, and now their teeth felt like gravel. These were oral traditions, pun fully intended, and they worked well enough to continue. What's most striking is that these substances did not promote decay the way modern sugary pastes might. Unlike commercial toothpaste packed with artificial sweeteners or acids, neither ash nor clay fed bacteria. If anything, their abrasiveness, pH neutrality and cleansing properties helped reduce build-up and keep the mouth in decent balance. Of course, these methods weren't perfect. Overuse of abrasive materials could wear down enamel, especially on already softened teeth from years of chewing gritty bread. And there was no understanding of bacteria or gum disease, so brushing the gums or flossing, if it existed at all, was hit or miss. But within the world of medieval oral care, these natural materials were some of the best tools available, and they were used with surprising regularity. In some monasteries, the practice of using tooth powder was formalised. Recipes survive that suggest combinations of ash, dried herbs, and even salt to clean the mouth before prayer or meals. This added a sense of ritual to the routine and may have elevated the act from mere necessity to a small gesture of care, of beginning the day fresh, both in body and in breath. So no, they didn't have candy, but they did have clay. And while medieval peasants couldn't have known the science behind their tools, their instincts led them to practices that helped preserve their teeth longer than modern assumptions give them credit for. While clay and ash made up the backbone of rural dental care, another substance occasionally found its way into the medieval peasant's oral hygiene routine: charcoal. Not the same kind tossed casually onto a modern grill, but a finely powdered form deliberately made from burned wood and used sparingly to clean the teeth. Among those who had access, powdered charcoal was valued not just for its gritty texture, but for its perceived purifying qualities. Charcoal had long been recognised across many ancient medical systems, from Roman to Arabic to Indian, for its ability to draw out toxins and cleanse surfaces. By the medieval period, monks, healers and wise women alike had carried forward this knowledge, especially in places where herbalism and early chemistry overlapped. In rural homes, where fire was ever present and hearths burned day and night, charcoal wasn't hard to find. Certain types of wood, especially willow or birch, were known to produce a softer ash and lighter charcoal that, once ground finely, could be used as a tooth powder. Peasants who used charcoal would usually crush it into a dust using stones or mortar, then apply a small amount with a dampened finger or cloth. Some may have even mixed it with a little water or added herbs like sage or thyme to create a more agreeable taste. The result wasn't flavourful. Charcoal is bland and slightly bitter, but it gave the user a clear sense that their teeth had been scrubbed. Importantly, charcoal was alkaline, which meant it didn't feed bacteria the way sugars or acidic foods might. It also acted as a mild abrasive, helping to polish the teeth and remove the residue of meals without damaging the enamel if used sparingly. This made it especially useful after meals that included meat or fermented foods, which could leave behind strong odours or greasy films. Some medieval texts even describe using charcoal to remove foul humours of the mouth, reinforcing the idea that charcoal was considered a tool not just for cleaning, but for restoring balance to the body. However, not all charcoal was created equal. The kind used for fuel, dense, smoky and full of contaminants, was too coarse and potentially harmful. The charcoal used for oral care needed to be dry, clean burning and carefully crushed. In many cases, its use was seasonal or limited to wealthier homes and monasteries where the knowledge of safe preparation was better preserved. Among peasants, it may have been a luxury used occasionally or shared as advice during times of toothache or foul breath. While the average medieval peasant couldn't explain the science, their experience and observation told them that charcoal left the mouth cleaner. And in a world without dentists, that feeling alone was reason enough to keep using it. Just as finely powdered charcoal found its place among the limited but effective tools for cleaning teeth, so too did the ash of burned herbs, a gentler, more fragrant cousin in the world of medieval oral care. While charcoal came from burned wood and required effort to prepare correctly, herbal ash was often created during everyday rituals, dried leaves and stems tossed onto the fire, or herbs intentionally burned for medicinal or spiritual use. The resulting ash wasn't simply discarded. It was believed to be potent, purifying, and in many cases curative. This belief had deep roots. In both religious and folk traditions, burning herbs symbolized cleansing not only of space or spirits, but of the body as well. Monks burned rosemary and sage to fumigate sick rooms, women smudged their homes with lavender or thyme, and healers burned bitter herbs to ward off illness. The leftover ash, then, was more than just waste. It was imbued with symbolic purity and practical properties too. Some medieval people, particularly those who had access to herb gardens or monastic knowledge, began to use these powdered remnants of healing plants to clean their teeth. Sage ash was one of the most common, valued for its mildly antiseptic qualities and fresh scent. Thyme and mint ash were also used, especially when bad breath or mouth pain were present. The fine, soft texture of these ashes made them less abrasive than charcoal or wood ash, yet they still provided a slight grit that helped scrub away residue and left behind a trace of herbal freshness. Often, these ashes were combined with salt, powdered clay, or wine vinegar to form early cleansing pastes or powders. For peasants, these mixtures were applied with a cloth, a fingertip, or a twig. For those in monasteries or households with greater access to herbal remedies, the ash might be mixed with oil or honey, creating a thicker paste used for rubbing the teeth and gums. These pastes were crude by modern standards, but effective in their own way, especially when used consistently. What made herbal ash especially appealing was the multifunctional nature of the herbs themselves. Sage and rosemary, for instance, were known not only for mouth health but also for aiding memory and digestion. Using their ash may have been seen as offering broader benefits, cleansing the mouth while strengthening the body and spirit. This idea aligned with the holistic worldview of the time, in which dental health wasn't separated from overall well-being. In a world without toothbrushes, toothpaste, or scientific understanding of bacteria, medieval people did what they could with what they had. And in the quiet corners of peasant homes, by firelight and fading embers, the ash of a burned herb might be gently rubbed along the teeth, carrying with it centuries of tradition, a touch of belief, and the hope that a cleaner mouth meant a healthier body. In the same way, ash from burned herbs provided a gentle and symbolic cleansing. Other mineral-based substances found their way into the medieval approach to oral care, sometimes even in surprising combinations. Among these, one of the more accessible and widely used materials was chalk. Chalk, being soft and easy to crush, was familiar to many medieval communities, especially those near natural deposits of limestone or coastal regions where chalk cliffs and stones were common. In its natural form, chalk was already used for various household purposes, marking, whitening cloth, or even as a mild polishing agent. Its usefulness extended to dental care when people discovered that finely crushed chalk created a smooth, powdery substance that could be rubbed onto the teeth. But it didn't stop there. The chalk dust was often combined with salt, a mineral already valued for its cleansing, preserving, and mildly abrasive properties. Salt alone had been used to scrub the gums and stimulate circulation, but when paired with chalk, the result was a primitive but effective paste. The salt added grit, the chalk a polishing quality. Together they created one of the earliest known forms of toothpaste-like mixtures, though that term wouldn't exist for centuries. This combination wasn't fancy or flavoured, but it served a purpose. When mixed with a few drops of water or wine vinegar, it formed a paste that could be applied by finger, cloth or twig to rub away build-up. The alkaline nature of chalk meant it helped neutralise the acids left behind from fermented foods, and the salt acted as a basic antiseptic, killing off some of the bacteria that might otherwise cause odour or irritation. For those who had suffered tooth pain in the past, this paste became part of a cautious routine, not done every day perhaps, but used when something didn't feel quite right. In regions with access to finer materials, chalk paste might even be enhanced with powdered herbs or floral ash, blending mineral and plant remedies in one. But even among peasants, the base ingredients, chalk and salt, were often available. Salt was a valuable commodity, yes, but it was used sparingly in these preparations. A pinch was enough to make a difference. Interestingly, some medieval healers recommended this mixture not just for cleaning but also for whitening. While beauty standards varied across time and place, clean and healthy-looking teeth were sometimes associated with good health and virtue. Chalk and salt paste may have brightened teeth just enough to support their image when used before holy days or festivals. And so in cottages and abbeys alike, this humble blend of stone dust and sea salt became another quiet tool in the medieval dental toolkit, a small act of care performed in kitchens and hearths, part of a broader tradition of managing the body with the resources the land provided. While mixtures like chalk and salt paste were practical and accessible, they were also, by modern standards, remarkably harsh on the mouth. There were no soft bristled brushes, no fluoride to protect enamel, no soothing gels to ease the sting. Everything was coarse, gritty and raw, a reflection of the medieval environment itself. Yet, despite this abrasive nature, these methods often proved more effective than we might expect. For peasants with limited resources, effectiveness meant simplicity. A rough powder that removed grime was better than no cleaning at all, and when combined with herbal ash, charcoal or clay, the texture of these substances often left teeth visibly cleaner and smoother, even if it meant the occasional gum irritation or tooth sensitivity. The very act of rubbing, scrubbing or chewing, no matter how primitive, prevented some of the plaque buildup that leads to cavities and gum disease today. Of course, the tools themselves were crude. A bit of cloth, a stick, even a frayed twig were the closest things to toothbrushes in many peasant households. And the mixtures they applied, they stung. Salt aggravated sore spots. Charcoal left grit under the tongue. Vinegar-based rinses were acidic enough to cause discomfort. But medieval people weren't seeking a spa-like experience. They were trying to ward off rot, odour and pain with what they had. And in many cases, they succeeded. Modern analysis of medieval skeletons often reveals teeth that are worn but intact, with fewer cavities than one might expect from an era without dentists. That's not to say their teeth were perfect, far from it, but compared to the modern era, when high sugar diets and acidic drinks wreak havoc even with advanced dental care, medieval mouths fared relatively well. The low sugar diet helped, of course, but the routine use of abrasive materials played its part, removing food particles and reducing bacterial buildup. Some individuals, especially monks and herbalists, may have taken these routines further. They experimented with combinations, observed the effects of various pastes and powders, and recorded their findings in handwritten recipes or passed them down orally. Over time, a rough body of knowledge grew. Not quite dental science, but a form of trial and error medicine that kept decay at bay. And so, for all their roughness, these methods were grounded in necessity and adapted to the realities of medieval life. There were no appointments, no fillings, and no fluoride treatments. There was ash, salt, chalk, charcoal, and stubborn determination. It may have hurt, but it helped. Though medieval people had no knowledge of fluoride as we define it today, some of the tools they used to protect their teeth weren't only physical. They came from the groundwater they drank daily, long before mineral content was measured or bottled for sale. And it turns out this may have provided a hidden layer of dental protection that no one in the medieval world could name, but many benefited from all the same. In the last chapter, we explored how harsh, gritty substances like chalk, salt, and ash could help clean teeth despite their abrasive nature. But those materials weren't acting alone. Medieval diets and dental routines were deeply tied to the land, and nowhere is this more evident than in the water that flowed through streams, wells, and cisterns. Much of it contained trace minerals that, while invisible, quietly reinforced the structure of teeth, especially in regions where fluoride occurred naturally. Fluoride, a naturally occurring mineral found in soil and rock, leaches into groundwater over time. In medieval Europe, this meant that certain wells and springs, depending on their geology, contained small amounts of it. Without knowing it, communities who drank from these sources were getting the early benefits of what we now call fluoride treatments. It wasn't consistent across regions, of course. A village at the base of a limestone cliff might have a different water profile than one pulling from a shallow clay basin. But where fluoride was present, it entered the body gradually and regularly, strengthening developing teeth and helping to prevent demineralization over time. We don't have medieval records describing mineral-rich water as a cause for good dental health, because the idea wouldn't have made sense then. But we do know that monastic communities sometimes prized certain springs for their healthful properties, noting that water from specific wells seemed to restore energy, settle digestion, or keep people strong of tooth and bone. These were likely the earliest unknowing recognitions of mineral content affecting overall health. The same went for villagers who chose one well over another based on taste or clarity. A slightly chalky flavour might indicate a higher level of calcium or fluoride. While modern palates might reject such water, medieval people often preferred it, not just for taste, but for the belief that clearer, fresher water was cleaner and more nourishing. And in truth, it often was. Beyond fluoride, many natural waters also carried other helpful minerals like calcium, magnesium and phosphate, all of which contribute to enamel strength. So even when a peasant wasn't rubbing their teeth with chalk or brushing them with a sage stick, every sip of local well water could be reinforcing their teeth in subtle ways. Over a lifetime, these trace exposures added up, making their enamel harder and more resistant to the everyday wear and tear of coarse bread, grit-filled vegetables and jaw-aching meats. Interestingly, in some regions where fluoride-rich water was common, archaeological studies show fewer incidences of deep cavities or widespread decay, not just in teeth that survived adulthood, but in those of children as well. This implies that from a young age, fluoride in drinking water was quietly protecting enamel during its formative years, long before anyone understood what enamel even was. This wasn't true everywhere, of course. In areas with soft water or acidic springs, teeth might have suffered more, especially in towns where brewing or fermenting replaced fresh water as the daily drink. Ale, while safer than river water in many cases, lacked the minerals that well water provided. It was boiled, yes, and spiced with herbs, but it did not help fortify the body the way hard, mineral-rich water could. Still, even in these cases, regional food and clay exposure helped to close the gap. Eating off ceramic or stoneware dishes, for instance, sometimes introduced mineral traces through the food. Handling soil during planting season or grinding grains with stone tools meant more contact with natural elements, and for many, a bit of that dust entered the mouth each day. This all points to one clear truth. Even without knowing it, medieval people were often more mineral aware than they realised. They noticed when water felt healthy, when teeth were strong and white, and when a certain place seemed to produce hardier children. It may not have been scientific understanding, but it was observation, and that guided their habits. Modern fluoride treatments are highly refined, measured in parts per million, and administered via toothpaste, with mouthwash or community water systems. But in the Middle Ages, it came as part of life itself. The very ground they walked on, the water they drank, the dirt they tilled, the clay they touched, carried trace elements that quietly supported their dental health, not always perfectly, not everywhere, but enough that the myth of the rotten-mouthed medieval peasant begins to crumble under close scrutiny. Their world was dirty, yes, but also deeply connected to nature's own pharmacy. And sometimes the best dental protection came not from what they did, but from the land they lived on. Of course, not every medieval settlement was blessed with the same water. While most villages relied on wells, cisterns or small rivers, a few regions were home to something a little more remarkable: naturally occurring mineral springs, many of which were quietly rich in fluoride. These springs were often regarded with a kind of reverence, even if no one understood the precise chemical properties of the water they offered. Still, people knew there was something special about them. Across medieval Europe, springs that emerged from chalky hillsides or limestone-rich soils were considered healing. Pilgrims travelled to certain wells not only for spiritual reasons, but because the water there was said to strengthen the body, restore vitality, and even alleviate toothache. Monastic texts from the 12th and 13th centuries sometimes mention specific springs where the brethren preferred to draw their water, noting its whiteness, clearness, or soft taste. Today, when those sources are tested, they often reveal elevated levels of natural fluoride and calcium, both crucial to dental and bone health. In places like parts of England's South Downs or regions of France with deep limestone aquifers, children who drank from these fluoride-rich springs likely entered adulthood with stronger enamel and fewer cavities. The villagers may not have noticed this in clinical terms, but they did notice that some families had better teeth or fewer mouth troubles, and in many cases that local reputation stuck. The tooth-strong water of a particular hamlet might be passed down as lore, long before science could explain why. Even within the same region, differences could be stark. A village drawing from a spring running over mineral-rich stone might have far better dental outcomes than a neighbouring community relying on rainwater cisterns. Geology shaped dental health, whether people realised it or not. Some of these fluoride-rich springs eventually became famous in later centuries for their supposed healing powers. But during the Middle Ages, they were more likely to be tied to local saints, miracles, or ancient traditions. And yet, as people filled their buckets and flasks, they were unwittingly participating in one of the earliest forms of preventative dental care. Not with a brush or a rinse, but with every sip they took. So while medieval oral care looked primitive on the surface, it was deeply rooted in environment and habit. And in some corners of Europe, nature lent a helping hand, one clear drop at a time. And just as some villagers were lucky enough to sip naturally mineral-rich water, many more consumed their minerals the medieval way, by eating them, or rather, by boiling them. One of the most overlooked dietary staples in the medieval world, especially among the peasantry, was bone broth, a long-simmered, nutrient-rich liquid made from the discarded parts of animals, feet, knuckles, ribs and skulls. Nothing was wasted. And when these were simmered for hours, sometimes days, what emerged was more than just a hot meal. It was a medicinal tonic, packed with the very nutrients that teeth need most. Peasant households, working with limited meat and struggling to stretch every scrap, relied on bone broth to make thin soups more filling. But what they may not have realised was that this slow-cooked liquid was delivering calcium, phosphorus, magnesium and gelatin, all of which are vital to the development and maintenance of healthy bones and teeth. Children raised on broths from an early age were likely getting a steady trickle of minerals during their most critical dental development years, even if meat itself was rare. In an age without vitamin supplements or fortified foods, bone broth was as close as they came to dietary insurance, and because it was made in large pots and consumed communally, everyone, young and old, benefited. A stew of cabbage and barley might offer fibre and bulk, but when built on a base of broth drawn from pig joints or oxtails, it became a quiet agent of oral resilience. The minerals absorbed during long boils leached directly from the bones, and when consumed regularly, contributed to stronger enamel and better jaw development. Interestingly, in many peasant recipes, vinegar or acidic herbs were added to the pot not for flavour, but to help break down the bone and extract more from it. Monastic kitchens and folk cooks alike understood that a bit of sourness helped draw the goodness out. Today, we recognise this as a way to release calcium into the liquid, yet another example of practical wisdom born from observation, not science. So while medieval people didn't sip milk by the glass or chew calcium tablets, they found another way. Through a daily bowl of broth, ladled out with care and shared among family, they supported not just their strength or warmth, but their dental durability as well. And in a world where medical help was scarce, a chipped tooth could become a lasting problem, so anything that helped maintain strong, pain-free teeth was quietly valued, even if it came from the bottom of the stew pot. While hearty broths help build strong teeth from within, what happened when something went wrong? A sudden ache, a swollen gum, a loose tooth that wouldn't sit right. In a world without dentists as we know them, the task of managing such pain often fell to the most trusted and available figures in the community: local wives, herbalists, and midwives. These were not formally trained professionals, but women who had inherited generations of practical knowledge and who understood in deeply tactile ways the workings of the human body. Every village had at least one wise woman. Sometimes she was also the midwife, the one who delivered babies and set broken bones. Other times she was the widow who kept drying racks of herbs in her eaves and knew exactly which leaves to steep when a child had a fever or a man couldn't sleep. Toothaches, in this context, were part of a broader system of body care, treated with whatever nature and memory could provide. Sage leaves rubbed on the gums, warm compresses steeped in chamomile, mouth rinses made from wine vinegar, thyme, or crushed cloves. These weren't random treatments. They were part of a long oral tradition of care, remedies passed between mothers and daughters, neighbours and apprentices, often without being written down. The pain of an abscess, the ache of a teething child, the sting of swollen gums, these were all familiar challenges, and women knew how to meet them. Sometimes they'd heat a small iron rod and use it to drain an infected spot. Other times they'd pack the gum with a mash of garlic and crushed herbs believed to draw out the poison. It wasn't comfortable, it wasn't sterile, but it was a form of care rooted in close observation and lived experience. And for many peasants, it was the only care available. These remedies varied regionally, depending on what herbs grew nearby or what knowledge was preserved in the local lineage. One village might use yarrow, while another preferred comfrey. But the thread that united them all was this: healing was communal, domestic, and female-led. The healer didn't wear a white coat. She wore an apron and smelled of rosemary. And though she couldn't fill a cavity or replace a missing tooth, she could soothe the pain, stop the swelling, and offer something warm to hold while it passed. In a world without dentists, she was the next best thing, and often far more trusted than any travelling barber surgeon with a pair of tongs. But when even the wisest woman in the village couldn't calm the pain, when poultices failed, herbs no longer soothed, and the infection throbbed too deep to bear, there was one final option, and it was not for the faint of heart. You found the barber. Not the sort of barber you'd trust to trim your beard and chat about weather, but rather the multitasking, bloodletting, limb-setting, tooth-yanking kind who roamed between towns or worked in the back of a local shop with shears, leeches and blades in his apron. Medieval barbers, often called barber surgeons, were expected to handle the messier task that no one else wanted to touch, and that included dental extractions. By the late Middle Ages, the barber surgeon had become a semi-professional figure, known more for brawn than bedside manner. There were no anaesthetics, no numbing agents. If you were lucky, he might offer you a stiff drink or have you bite down on a piece of leather. Then came the tongs, or a hook, or whatever tool he favoured that day. Tooth-pulling was fast, brutal, and often done in full public view, in a market square, on a stool surrounded by gawkers. If the root broke, it might require a second attempt, or a third, and yet people lined up for it. When the pain was worse than the fear, they came, because an abscessed tooth could kill, if not from infection, then from the fever it brought. And even if death didn't follow, the suffering could be relentless. A gaping socket and days of swelling were, for many, the lesser evil. Barber surgeons learned their trade on the job. Some were better than others. The most skilled might extract quickly and cleanly. The least skilled could cause more damage than the tooth itself. In some towns, guilds tried to regulate their practice, issuing standards for when and how teeth should be pulled. But in rural areas, it was often improvisation and strong hands that got the job done. In paintings and manuscripts, barbers were sometimes depicted as grim-faced or comically incompetent, tugging at a patient's head while assistants held the arms. These images, though exaggerated, reveal a simple truth. Tooth extraction was painful, crude, and a last resort, and yet it was part of the dental landscape. Not common, but present, not ideal, but necessary. When herbs failed and bone broth couldn't heal, when the wise woman shook her head and said, "It must come out," that's when the barber's knock was heard, and people opened the door, trembling but relieved. For all the assumptions about rotting teeth and foul breath, the reality is more surprising. Medieval people, especially peasants, often kept their teeth longer and in better shape than we'd expect. They didn't have dentists, electric toothbrushes, or fluoride toothpaste. But they also didn't have ultra-processed snacks, sugar-laden drinks, or modern eating patterns that quietly chip away at our enamel every day. When it comes down to it, the real reason medieval teeth survived wasn't luck or mystery, it was lifestyle. One of the most significant differences was how and when people ate. The medieval diet followed the rhythm of labour and season. Meals were few, typically 2 or 3 a day, and structured around physical activity and daylight. Unlike modern snacking habits, where grazing all day is the norm, peasants rarely ate between meals. That meant their mouths had long stretches of time to recover from food exposure. Less snacking meant fewer acid attacks on the enamel, allowing saliva to naturally buffer the mouth's pH and limit demineralization. Their food was also, by necessity, simple and unprocessed. No refined carbohydrates, no syrups, no candy bars or sticky cereals. Bread was dense and dark, often coarse with ground bran and occasional grit from millstones. Fruits were seasonal. Sweets, when available, came in the form of rare honey or dried berries. This low-sugar, low-acid diet didn't promote the kind of sticky plaque build-up we struggle with today. It was tough, fibrous food that required chewing, and lots of it. In fact, that chewing did more than just keep jaws strong. It helped clean teeth. Raw vegetables, tough grains, and even dried meats acted as natural abrasives, scraping away plaque and debris with every bite. In effect, food was both sustenance and tool. Each meal gave the teeth a mini scrub, not a replacement for brushing perhaps, but certainly more helpful than a diet of soft, sugary snacks. Moreover, while peasants didn't have minty mouthwash or plastic floss, they made use of the resources around them. Natural remedies, like sage leaves rubbed on the gums, vinegar rinses, and herbal infusions, weren't just traditions, they were practical tools for gum health. These treatments helped reduce inflammation, limit infection, and keep oral tissues in better condition. It's important to note that their mouths weren't perfect. Teeth were often worn down by age 40, especially from the grit in bread or the coarse texture of their food. Abscesses happened. Some people lost teeth from injury or infection, but widespread rot, blackened stumps, or toothless youths, these were not the norm. For the average peasant, dental health was a byproduct of necessity. They didn't eat sugar because they couldn't afford it. They didn't snack because food was rationed. They chewed coarse meals because that's all they had. And in doing so, they unknowingly protected their teeth from the very threats that modern diets introduce daily. So no, it wasn't magic. It was no secret recipe or forgotten potion. The real reason medieval teeth endured was simple: a rough life, a rough diet, but a surprisingly tooth-friendly one. And now, dear listener, it's time to rest. You've journeyed through soot and sage, through barley loaves and bone broth, and discovered that even the past had a way of smiling. Strong, simple, and a little bit stained. So close your eyes, let the candle gutter low, let your thoughts drift like smoke from a peat fire. Wherever you are, under quilts beside rain-slick windows, curled like a cat, may your dreams be soft, your jaw relaxed, and your heart light. Sleep well, sleep deep, and remember, history isn't gone, it's just whispering quietly in the dark. Good night.